Chapter 1784. A place of cultivation in the starry sky. Yi Xian sat cross-legged in the starry sky with his eyes closed. He'd been studying the spacetime Tao every single day during this period of time. Presently, he was able to condense 38 rivers of time. Even though it wasn't a lot, he'd grasped the trick of it. Attaining limitless was only a matter of time for him now. Moreover, he noticed that with every river of time he formed, his strength would increase greatly. Presently, he was able to overlap 400 sword drawing techniques. He was able to overlap 400 sword drawing techniques without utilizing the energy of his bloodline. In other words, he could go head-on against a saint even without using the green profound sword. However, he wasn't completely confident in his ability to defeat a great saint. But a minor saint wasn't a threat to him anymore. Spacetime. Yi Xian opened his hands and waved them lightly. Gradually, the space around him started to tremble. Countless strands of time energy converged towards him. Gradually, the power of time surged around him like a river. The energy of time. Yi Xian opened his palm, and then countless strands of time energy converged towards his palm. Gradually, a river of time condensed within his palm. It might seem small, but the space within it was extremely large. Because he'd utilized the energy of space. Yi Xian gazed at the river of time in his hand. After a short moment of silence, he issued a command in his heart. In an instant, the river of time in his hand transformed into a translucent sword. The Sword of Time. As he gazed at the sword in his hand, a thought silently appeared in Yi Xian's mind. He glanced at the rivers of time around him, and then he closed his eyes slowly. The rivers of time around him started to tremble, and then they gradually condensed into swords. Translucent swords of time. Yi Xian instantly felt quite excited when he saw this scene. He opened his palm, sheathed the sword of time in his hand, and then suddenly pulled it out. Bang! As soon as he pulled it out, the sword of time in his hand shattered. Yi Xian was struck dumb at the sight of this. Is it so brittle? I'm unwilling. He tried a few more times, but the sword condensed from the energy of time was truly too brittle, and it couldn't endure his drawing technique at all. Yi Xian frowned. After trying many times, it still didn't work. But soon, another thought appeared in his mind. Yi Xian opened his palm and the sword in his hand flew out. Yi Xian was stunned. That was because the sword was too fast. How fast? It was so fast that he couldn't even catch a glimpse of it. How could it be so fast? Yi Xian was puzzled. After studying it for a moment, he understood. The reason why the time sword was so fast was because it wasn't just condensed from the power of time, it also contained the power of space. To be precise, it was the sword of time and space. His river of time was different from others, because his river of time was built on space. He did not separate the two, but instead combined them. And precisely because of this, his heaven ascension boundary was different from other heaven ascension boundaries. Although he was still in the same realm, he was no longer walking the normal realm. He was walking the path of the Qinger. Flying swords. Yi Xian decided to study flying swords. With the spacetime sword, if he cultivated flying swords, then the flying swords would become very terrifying. Not to mention a little saint, even a great saint might not be able to withstand it. Drawing the sword to determine life and death was explosive. And flying swords were about speed, about surprise, and killing in one move. As if thinking of something, he took out the nameless sword technique that he obtained from Xiao Linlang. This nameless sword technique was also a sword technique. And it seemed extraordinary. Yi Xian began to study the nameless sword technique. After studying it for a moment, Yi Xian was a little surprised, because he found that some of the sword techniques in the nameless sword technique were worth learning. Such as drawing the sword. There were a total of 9 ways to draw the sword in the nameless sword technique. Among them was drawing the sword. Similar to his father's sword drawing technique, drawing the sword was about explosive power. That instant of explosive power. However, the drawing of the sword in the nameless sword technique was simply drawing the sword, and there was no superposition method. Without superposition, no matter how powerful the drawing of the sword was, its power was limited. And in addition to drawing the sword, there was another way to draw the sword, finger sword. Finger sword. Yi Xian opened his palm, and a scabbard appeared in his hand. He held the time box sword in his right hand and put it into the scabbard. After a moment of silence, he suddenly flicked his thumb. Chi! A ray of sword light flashed across the field. The ray of sword light was so fast that it could not be seen by the naked eye. Yi Xian was a little shocked. This was because he realized that after he used the finger sword technique, his speed had really become faster. Finger sword. It was all about one word, fast. Drawing the sword at the fastest speed. He didn't need to use his right hand at all. Holding the sword with his left hand, he could draw the sword with his left hand, and it was a surprise attack. Yi Xian continued to study the nameless sword technique. He found that there were other powerful swordsmen in this world besides Qing, and his father, and these swordsmen were all worthy for Yi Xian to learn. While Yi Xian was practicing, no one came to disturb him. Dao Yi came twice, but seeing that he was practicing, he chose not to disturb him. Yi Xian, who was concentrating on his practice, was also clear about the path he wanted to take now. Take the path of Qing. As for the sword technique, he only had one thought. Kill. It was best to kill the enemy with one move. He didn't need any fancy tricks, the simpler the better. Whether it was the life-terminating sword technique or the flying sword technique, there was only one goal, and that was to kill faster. 3 days later. The incomplete nameless sword technique had been fully understood by Yi Xian. It was actually a powerful sword technique, but in terms of power, it was much weaker than life-terminating sword technique. Not to mention that it was incomplete. Even if it was complete, it would be far inferior to his life-terminating sword technique. It should be said that there was no comparison at all. However, there were many things worth learning from the nameless sword technique. His father and Qing were qualified to look down on swordsmen in the world, but Yi Xian was not qualified. There were many swordsmen that Yi Xian could learn from. In the following days, Yi Xian mainly studied the flying sword. He did not look for a powerful flying sword technique, he was preparing to create his own powerful flying sword technique. The process was not that easy, but he enjoyed it very much. While Yi Xian was practicing, an elder from the small grotto heaven came to the great spiritual palace. Spiritual palace. Inside the palace, Lin Jiang glanced at the elder from the small grotto heaven. Elder Jiao, why did you come all the way to the great spiritual palace? Elder Jiao smiled. Palace Master Lin, Cave Master asked me to send his regards to Palace Master Lin. Lin Jiang nodded. It has been 1,000 years since we last met. Is Cave Master Qiu doing well? Elder Jiao smiled. Cave Master is doing well. He fishes and sleeps every day. His life is very comfortable. Lin Jiang nodded. Since he asked you to come here, he must have something to say. Just say it. Elder Jiao nodded. Palace Master Lin, to be honest, I am here for something. Palace Master Lin, did you recently recruit a young man named Yi Xian? Yi Xian. Lin Jiang narrowed his eyes. You are here for him. Elder Jiao nodded. Yes. Lin Jiang looked at Elder Jiao. He is indeed in the great spiritual palace. Elder Jiao said, Palace Master Lin, to be honest, this man is wanted by the small grotto heaven. Lin Jiang frowned. Wanted? Elder Jiao nodded. This man killed my men. We have been looking for him for a long time. He stood up and bowed. Palace Master Lin, please hand this man over to me. I will bring him back. Lin Jiang asked in a deep voice, did he kill someone from your grotto heaven? Elder Jiao nodded. Yes. Not only him, but there is also a lady behind him. She has gone into hiding and we can't find her. As for Yi Xian, please hand him over to me. I will bring him back. Lin Jiang kept quiet. He did not expect Yi Xian to have a grudge against the small grotto heaven. This fella is not easy to deal with. He even killed people from the small grotto heaven. He is now an outer disciple of the great spiritual palace. Lin Jiang said after a moment of silence. Elder Jiao said, Palace Master Lin, this man is not easy to deal with. Moreover, he killed someone from the small grotto heaven. We will not rest until he is dead. Not rest until he is dead. Lin Jiang kept quiet. He was in a dilemma. If he protected Yi Xian, he would be making enemies with the small grotto heaven. Of course, the great spiritual palace was not afraid of the small grotto heaven. However, was it worth it for Yi Xian? Although Yi Xian was an outer disciple, he believed that someone like Yi Xian would leave sooner or later. Therefore, he did not treat Yi Xian as one of his own. However, if he were to hand Yi Xian over just like that, Yi Xian would definitely not cooperate. He might even view the great spiritual palace as an enemy. Elder Jiao suddenly said, Palace Master Lin Jiang, this man and the lady must be killed by the small grotto heaven. He could see it. Lin Jiang was hesitant. Therefore, he showed his determination to the small grotto heaven again. Not far away. Lin Jiang still had not made a decision. Suddenly, a voice rang in his mind. Why don't you let him and Yi Xian deal with it themselves? Lin Jiang said after a moment of silence, Someone, summon Yi Xian. Biku Dao. XYZ, Yi Xian. In the starry sky cultivation ground. Yi Xian, who was cultivating, suddenly stopped. He turned around and saw Gu Qing walking towards him slowly. Yi Xian smiled. Elder Gu Qing, what's the matter? Gu Qing smiled. I hope I didn't disturb your cultivation. Yi Xian shook his head. No. Gu Qing nodded. The palace master is looking for you. Yi Xian frowned. The palace master is looking for me? Gu Qing nodded. Yes. Yi Xian asked. Did he say what's the matter? Gu Qing shook his head. No. Yi Xian thought for a moment and said, Can I not go? Gu Qing smiled bitterly. This, Yi Xian smiled. Never mind. I won't put you in a difficult position. He was about to leave when Gu Qing suddenly said, Someone from the small grotto heaven is here. They might be looking for you. Be careful. Small grotto heaven. Yi Xian was stunned, and then he smiled. I understand. Then, he vanished on the spot. Spirit God Palace. As soon as Yi Xian walked into the palace, Elder Jiao's gaze descended onto Yi Xian. Lin Jiang looked at Yi Xian and smiled. Yi Xian, this person is Elder Jiao from the small grotto heaven. He said that there's some enmity between you and the small grotto heaven, and he wants to take you back. Elder Jiao stood up and stared at Yi Xian. Yi Xian, you, Yi Xian raised his thumb that held the sword in his left hand. Hiss. Elder Jiao's head flew into the air. Yi Xian looked at the stunned Lin Jiang. Is there anything else, Palace Master? Lin Jiang. Chapter 1785. Instant kill. Needless to say, Chen Jiang was extremely shocked at this moment. This fellow killed Elder Jiao in an instant? Elder Jiao is a minor saint as well. Moreover, the speed of Yi Xian's flying sword was so fast that even he was a little shocked. It was too fast. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly smiled, Palace Master, if there's nothing else, then I'll be leaving. As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. However, he suddenly stopped when he arrived at the door and said, Palace Master, I have no ill intentions towards Great Spiritual Palace, and I don't want to have any bad karma with you. Don't worry, Palace Master, the matter between me and the minor cave heaven won't involve great spiritual palace. Qinjiang looked at Yi Xian. When are you leaving? All he wanted was for Yi Xian to leave. He felt uneasy that Yi Xian was in great spiritual palace. Yi Xian said with a smile, I can leave now. As he spoke, he opened his palm, and a wooden token floated before Qinjiang. It was the identity token of an outer court disciple. Yi Xian said, from this moment onwards, I have nothing to do with great spiritual palace. As soon as he finished speaking, he vanished. Qinjiang was silent in the hall. Meanwhile, Yan Shi suddenly appeared by Qinjiang's side, and he looked at Yi Xian who was leaving. The ancestor intends to rope him in. Qinjiang nodded. I know. Yan Shi turned to look at Qinjiang. He's not a bad person. Qinjiang said softly, he makes me feel uneasy. Moreover, if we choose to keep him, it's equivalent to becoming enemies with the minor cave heaven. Are we going to start a war with the minor cave heaven because of him? Yan Shi wanted to say something but hesitated. Qinjiang said, I know you think he's worth it. But have you ever thought that he has no sense of belonging to great spiritual palace? Perhaps he has other motives for coming to great spiritual palace, or perhaps he just wants to have some fun. Anyway, he's going to leave. Isn't that right? Yan Shi sighed softly. Qinjiang continued, previously, I thought there was still a chance for him to reconcile with the small grotto heaven. However, since he killed Elder Jiao of the small grotto heaven, it means there's no way for them to reconcile. If we let him stay in the divine palace, it would be equivalent to making an enemy out of the heavenly abode. Once the two super forces started a war, the consequences would be unbearable. Therefore, letting him leave is the best choice. Yan Shi nodded slightly. If the small grotto heaven and the great spiritual god palace were to start a war, the consequences would be terrifying. Sigh. Yan Shi sighed again, feeling that it was quite a pity. Yi Xian was no less talented than Li Yaoye. Moreover, Yi Xian was too suitable to enter the enforcement hall. However, as Qinjiang had said, the price of keeping Yi Xian alive was too great. Moreover, Yi Xian's heart was clearly not with the great spiritual palace. At this moment, Qinjiang suddenly said, send an order to the entire great spiritual palace. Yi Xian is no longer a member of the great spiritual palace. Then, he paused for a while and added, everyone in the great spiritual palace is not allowed to provoke this person. He was a little afraid of Yi Xian now. This guy is a freak. He will kill anyone who dares to provoke him. This elder doesn't even know how to teach him. He will get into big trouble in the future. Yi Xian did not leave the great spiritual palace immediately. Instead, he went to Exquisite Beauty Peak. In the courtyard, Dao Yi looked at Yi Xian. You're leaving? Yi Xian smiled. Yes. Dao Yi said, I'll go with you. Yi Xian shook his head. Stay here and cultivate. This place is not suitable for me, but it is suitable for you. Dao Yi shook his head. If you're not here, what's the point of me staying here? Yi Xian smiled. Stay here first. When the time comes, I'll find you a powerful master. Dao Yi was a little curious. A powerful master? Yi Xian nodded. Yes. Dao Yi blinked. How powerful? Yi Xian said, the very, very powerful kind. And it suits you the best. In fact, he wanted to find the supreme law now. Unfortunately, he could not find it. He could not sense the existence of the supreme law at all. After a moment of silence, Dao Yi said, then I'll wait for you. Yi Xian smiled. All right. Stay here and cultivate. If you're bullied, come and find me. Dao Yi shook his head. I came in with you. No one will dare to bully me. Yi Xian nodded. Take care. After that, he was about to leave. At this moment, Dao Yi suddenly said, be careful. Yi Xian smiled. I will. After that, he rode on his sword and disappeared into the horizon in the blink of an eye. Dao Yi looked at the sword light in the sky. After a long time, she shook her head and smiled. Then, she turned and left. After leaving the great spiritual god palace, Yi Xian went straight to Glittering Jewels Pavilion. He wanted to continue studying flying swords. Although he had killed a minor saint in an instant, he felt that it was not enough. His flying swords could be faster. Study. He wanted to find powerful sword techniques, especially those flying swords. He wanted to push his flying swords to the limit. As soon as he arrived at Glittering Jewels Pavilion, Miss Amo appeared in front of Yi Xian. Yi Xian smiled. Miss Amo, is Miss Glittering Jewels here? Amo shook her head. No. Yi Xian asked. Where can I find her? Amo hesitated. I'll contact her. Yi Xian smiled. Thank you. Amo shook her head. You're welcome. As she spoke, she took out a voice transmission talisman and crushed it. After a few breaths of time, the space beside Yi Xian suddenly trembled. In the next moment, a woman walked out. It was Xiao Linlang. Xiao Linlang looked at Yi Xian and smiled. Young Master Yi, we meet again. Yi Xian smiled. Miss Glittering Jewels, I don't come to you for no reason. I came to look for you this time to ask for your help. Xiao Linlang looked at Yi Xian. What help? Yi Xian said in a low voice. I want to find a powerful sword technique. It's best if it's the flying sword type. It wasn't easy to create a sword technique that belonged to him. Although his flying sword was fast enough, it wasn't fast enough. Therefore, he wanted to use the strengths of others to improve his own sword technique. Xiao Linlang frowned. Sword technique? Yi Xian nodded. Do you have one? Xiao Linlang thought for a moment. I don't. But I know a place that has it. Yi Xian hurriedly asked, where? Xiao Linlang looked at Yi Xian. One of the forbidden areas, North Cliff Sword Ruins. Yi Xian frowned. North Cliff Sword Ruins? Xiao Linlang nodded. That's a forbidden area. That nameless sword technique was obtained from there. However, even a great sage doesn't dare to go too deep into that place. Yi Xian asked in a low voice. Is it very dangerous? Xiao Linlang nodded. It's not an ordinary kind of danger. Not only does that place have a powerful sword formation, but it also has a strange and mysterious corrosive power. Even a sage's body can't withstand it. The level of danger there is second only to the other forbidden area, God's Graveyard. Yi Xian was curious. God's Graveyard? Xiao Linlang smiled. Legend has it that an ancient god fell there, so it's also called God's Graveyard. In any case, it's very dangerous. Yi Xian was silent for a moment. Miss Linlang, what kind of place is this North Cliff Sword Ruins that you mentioned? Xiao Linlang said, there used to be a swordsman sect there. However, for some reason, it gradually declined. In the end, it became a forbidden area. As for the history of that place, very few people knew. That's because they're not from the same era as us. Yi Xian smiled. I know. Xiao Linlang looked at Yi Xian. You're going? Yi Xian nodded. I'm going to look around. By the way, Miss Linlang, where is that place? Xiao Linlang asked in a low voice, you really want to go? Yi Xian smiled. Do I look like I'm joking? Xiao Linlang said, I'll go with you. Yi Xian was stunned. You're going with me? Xiao Linlang smiled. Am I not welcome? Yi Xian smiled. Of course not. I'm going to look for sword techniques. What are you going for, Miss Linlang? To look for treasures? Xiao Linlang smiled. First, to look for treasures. Second, I'm very curious. I want to know more about the North Cliff Sword ruins. What do you think? Yi Xian laughed. Of course. Let's go now. Xiao Linlang nodded. All right. With that, the two disappeared into the horizon. In the starry sky, Yi Xian flew on his sword with Xiao Linlang beside him. Yi Xian suddenly smiled. Miss Linlang, they say that you and Li Yaoya are the most talented people in the great spiritual god palace. Xiao Linlang shook her head. I'm nothing. The real geniuses are Li Yaoya and Wang Zhan from the Battle God Pavilion. Yi Xian frowned. Wang Zhan? Xiao Linlang nodded. A hot-tempered person. However, he's very strong. I heard that he's the most talented person in the history of the Battle God Pavilion. With that, she smiled. In this era, there are many geniuses. Young Master Yi too. Yi Xian was about to speak when Xiao Linlang suddenly smiled. Young Master Yi, do you want to spar? Spar. Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. No. Xiao Linlang smiled. Why? Yi Xian smiled and said, my sword skills are all for killing. If I don't have a murderous intent, the power of my sword skills isn't that strong. If I had a murderous intent. Miss Linlang and I have no enmity, why would I have a murderous intent? Xiao Linlang glanced at Yi Xian. I understand. Sword techniques. Just to kill. Yi Xian asked again, Miss Linlang, is there a strong swordsman in the ancient god galaxy? Xiao Linlang said, yes. A female swordsman from the outside world. She's very strong. A female swordsman. Yi Xian frowned. Could it be the Sword Heart from the Sword Alliance? At this moment, the two suddenly stopped. Yi Xian frowned. He turned his head and looked in the distance. In the depths of the starry sky, there was a sword ray tearing the starry sky. Who? As Yi Xian was puzzled, the sword ray landed in front of him. The sword ray dissipated and a woman appeared in front of Yi Xian. Yi Xian looked at the woman. You are? The woman stared at Yi Xian. Why are you like this? Don't you return what you borrowed? Yi Xian was stunned. He said, I borrowed something and don't return it. Miss, I don't know you. Don't talk nonsense. The woman looked at Yi Xian. You still don't want to admit it. I really don't know you. Yi Xian said solemnly. The woman said, if you borrow it. What do you want? Yi Xian was speechless. Miss, I really don't know you, and I've never borrowed anything from you. I, Yi Xian, may be shameless at times, but my character is still all right. I've never borrowed something and not returned it. The woman stared at Yi Xian. If I did, what would you do? Yi Xian smiled and said, if I borrowed something from you and didn't return it, I will compensate you 10 times. The woman nodded. I'm relieved to hear that. As she spoke, she opened her palm and a sword flew out from Yi Xian's body. It was that azure sword. The girl held the green sword and looked at Yi Xian 10 times. Yi Xian fell silent for a moment before he said, you were too hasty. Chapter 1786. Yi Xian did not expect that the woman in front of him was the owner of the green sword. That was really awkward. The woman looked at Yi Xian, why didn't you return the sword? Yi Xian smiled awkwardly. Miss, this is a misunderstanding. The woman was expressionless. If I didn't come looking for you, you wouldn't have returned it. Am I right? Yi Xian hurriedly shook his head, I didn't think so. The woman sneered, you didn't think so? You might not have thought so, but you've already done so. Yi Xian, the woman sheathed her sword and said, you're from the Sword Alliance. Yi Xian sized up the woman and said in shock, you're Jinxin? The woman frowned, you know me? Yi Xian hurriedly said, so it's senior sister. Hello senior sister, I'm Yi Xian, I just joined the Sword Alliance. The woman glanced at Yi Xian and quickly frowned, your bloodline. With that, she walked in front of Yi Xian and placed her right hand on Yi Xian's shoulder. Boom! In an instant, the blood in Yi Xian's body boiled. The woman glanced at Yi Xian, you're the sword master's son. Yi Xian nodded, yes. Jinshin was silent for a moment. Remember to return the things you borrow next time. Yi Xian hurriedly nodded, all right. Jinshin nodded, it's fine. I'm leaving. With that, she turned and left. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly said, senior sister, are you interested in going to the Northern Cliff Sword Mausoleum? Jinshin frowned, you want to go to the Northern Cliff Sword Mausoleum? Yi Xian nodded, yes. Jinshin shook her head, it's dangerous there. It's better not to go. Yi Xian smiled, I'll go and explore. Jinshin thought for a moment and said, all right. As she spoke, she glanced at Xiao Linlang. Miss Linlang. Xiao Linlang laughed, Miss Xinshin, long time no see. Yi Xian was a little surprised. You know each other? Xiao Linlang nodded, I once invited Miss Xinshin to be my guest. Yi Xian smiled and said, I see. Xiao Linlang smiled and said, let's go. The three of them continued on their way. An hour later, the three of them arrived at the North Cliff Sword Mausoleum. The Mausoleum of Swords was at the bottom of a cliff. The cliff was so deep that the bottom couldn't be seen, and it was shrouded in clouds and mist, causing it to reveal a mysterious feeling. Next to the cliff, Xiao Linlang looked down and said softly, the Mausoleum of Swords is below us. And in these clouds, there is an extremely powerful sword formation. Even a great sage wouldn't dare to barge in. Yi Xian said softly, this place used to be a powerful sect. Xiao Linlang nodded. Yes. And it might have been a swordsman sect. However, the sword chi here is too strong. We don't dare to go deep into the underground mountain range. The sword chi was too strong. Yi Xian blinked. Are you sure? Xiao Linlang nodded, her expression grave. Even I wouldn't dare to go deep into it. The corner of Yi Xian's mouth curled up slightly. Damn it. What was he least afraid of? It was sword chi. The invincible sword physique. Although he no longer cultivated his physical body, the invincible sword physique was still there. Moreover, with his current mastery of the sword Dao, the invincible sword physique was extraordinarily strong. He had never fallen behind on the invincible sword physique, nor had he given up on it. This was what Qing had taught him. At this thought, Yi Xian could not help but want to go down and absorb it. Not much. Qingcheng, Yi Clan, Ancestral Hall. Ancestors, Yi Xian has no talent, no virtue. From now on, Yi Xian's position as crown prince shall be replaced by Yi Lang. The speaker was an old man in a black robe. Not far behind the old man stood a young man with a faint smile on his face. This person was Yi Lang. On both sides were the Yi clan's elders. Why? At this time, a timid voice suddenly rang out in the ancestral hall. Everyone turned to look and saw a little girl standing at the door. She was about 12 or 13 years old, and her hands were tightly gripping the hem of her skirt. Her face had a sickly pallor, and she looked a little weak. There was even a trace of fear in her eyes. This little girl was called Yi Ling, Yi Xian's younger sister. When she heard that the clan wanted to remove Yi Xian, she disregarded her illness and rushed over. The black-robed old man frowned, Yi Ling, what are you doing? The little girl called Yi Ling bowed to the people in the ancestral hall, and said timidly, Great Elder, my brother Yi Xian is a crown prince, why do you want to remove him for no reason? The Great Elder looked coldly at Yi Ling, this is a matter of the clan, why are you interrupting? Leave. Yi Ling was obviously afraid, and did not dare to look directly at the Great Elder, but she did not leave. Instead, she mustered up her courage and walked into the ancestral hall. She bowed again to the elders on both sides, Elders, my brother is fighting with the Li clan over the mining rights at Nanshan. He is fighting for the clan, and his life is uncertain. But the clan is using a groundless excuse to remove him from the crown prince position. This is really unfair. Impudent. The great elder suddenly roared, it's not up to a little girl like you to decide whether to remove him or not. Men, drag her away. At this moment, the new crown prince Yi Lang suddenly laughed, you should be flogged 30 times as a warning to others. The great elder said coldly, then flog 30 times. Soon, 2 guards of the Yi clan rushed in. Yi Ling clenched her fists, and said angrily, this is unfair. My brother has risked his life for the clan for so many years, and even now he is fighting for the clan, but the clan is so unfair to him. One of the guards glanced at the new crown prince Yi Lang, and he knew that this was his chance to show off. The guard sneered, young master Yi Lang inherits the crown prince position, and it is everyone's wish. What are you shouting for? As he spoke, he raised his hand and slapped Yi Ling's face. Slap. A crisp slap sounded, and the right side of Yi Ling's face instantly swelled up, but she did not cry, and only covered her cheek tightly. Yi Lang looked at the guard, and smiled, what's your name? The guard hurriedly bowed, I'm Zhang Mu, greeting the crown prince. Yi Lang nodded, you're not bad. After I become the crown prince, I need 10 guards. You can be my guard from now on. Hearing this, Zhang Mu was overjoyed, and hurriedly bowed deeply, I'm willing to go through fire and water for the crown prince, even if I have to die 10,000 times. Yi Lang nodded slightly, drag him away. This person is disturbing the ancestral hall, don't show any mercy, understand? Zhang Mu glanced at Yi Lang, and when he saw the murderous intent in Yi Lang's eyes, he understood. Immediately, he grabbed Yi Ling's hair and dragged her out. At this moment, Zhang Mu seemed to have seen something, and he suddenly stopped. In the ancestral hall, everyone turned their heads to look outside. Not far from the ancestral hall, a young man was walking towards the ancestral hall. The young man was wearing a tight-fitting robe, and the robe was tattered, and there was blood everywhere. This person was Yi Xian, who had rushed back from the South Mountain. Seeing Yi Xian, Yi Lang's mouth curled into a cold smile. Inside the ancestral hall, the elders frowned. The great elder narrowed his eyes, and his expression was frighteningly dark. No one knew what he was thinking. From afar, when Yi Xian saw Zhang Mu dragging Yi Ling, his face turned savage, who gave you the guts to touch my sister? When Zhang Mu saw Yi Xian, his face changed. He quickly looked at Yi Lang, and was about to speak, when Yi Xian suddenly leaped in front of him like a ferocious tiger. Before the latter could react, Yi Xian's fist landed on his face. Pung! Zhang Mu felt a wave of dizziness, and he stumbled and fell. However, Yi Ling did not stop there, and charged towards Zhang Mu once more. At this time, Yi Lang suddenly roared, Yi Xian, he's my man, how dare you? Yi Xian suddenly stepped on Zhang Mu's chest. Pooh! Zhang Mu spat out a mouthful of blood. Seeing this, Yi Lang's face turned ugly. Yi Xian looked up at him, and snarled, your man? As he spoke, he stepped on Zhang Mu's face. Zhang Mu's face turned into a bloody mess, as he screamed, Prince, save me. Yi Xian did not care about Zhang Mu, as he walked to Yi Ling's side. Seeing Yi Ling's appearance, Yi Xian felt as though his heart was being cut by a knife. He clenched his fists, and his entire body trembled. When Yi Ling saw Yi Xian, her tears flowed out, brother, it hurts, it hurts. Hearing this, Yi Xian's expression turned savage, and in the next instant, he charged in front of Zhang Mu, and kicked Zhang Mu's head. Pung! Qingcheng, Yi Clan, Ancestral Hall. Ancestors, Yi Xian has no talent, no virtue. From now on, Yi Xian's position as prince shall be replaced by Yi Lang. The one who spoke was an old man in black robes. Not far behind the old man, there was a youth with a faint smile on his face. This person was Yi Lang. On both sides, there were the Yi clan elders. Why? At this time, a timid voice rang out in the ancestral hall. Everyone turned to look and saw a little girl standing at the door. She was about 12 or 13 years old, and her hands were tightly gripping the hem of her skirt. Her face had a sickly pallor, and she looked a little weak. There was even a trace of fear in her eyes. This little girl was called Yiling, and she was Yi Xian's younger sister. When she heard that the clan wanted to remove Yi Xian from his position, she disregarded her illness and rushed over. The black-robed old man frowned. "Yiling, what are you doing?" The little girl called Yiling bowed to the people in the ancestral hall, and said timidly, "Great elder, my brother Yi Xian is a prince. Why did you discard him for no reason?" The great elder looked at Yiling coldly. "This is a matter of the clan. What are you interrupting for? Leave." Yiling was obviously afraid, and did not dare to look at the great elder, but she did not leave. Instead, she plucked up her courage and entered the ancestral hall. She bowed again to the elders on both sides. "Dear elders, my brother is fighting with the Li clan over the mining rights at Nanshan. He is fighting for the clan, and we don't know if he's dead or alive. Yet, the clan is using a groundless excuse to discard his position. This is unfair. Impudent." The great elder suddenly raged. "Whether he discards his position or not, it's not up to a little girl like you to decide. Men, drag her away." At this time, the new prince, Yi Lang, suddenly laughed. "You should be flogged 30 times as a warning to others." The great elder replied coldly, "Then flog her 30 times. Soon, 2 guards of the Yi clan rushed in. Yiling clenched her fists, and said angrily, "This is unfair. My brother has risked his life for the clan for so many years, and even now, he is fighting for the clan. The clan is so unfair to him." One of the guards glanced at the new prince, Yi Lang. He knew that his chance to shine had come. The guard laughed coldly. "Young Master Yi Lang inherits the title of prince, and it's the wish of everyone. What are you shouting about?" As he spoke, he raised his hand and slapped Yi Ling's face. Slap. A crisp slap sounded, and the right side of Yi Ling's face instantly swelled up. However, she did not cry, and only held her cheek tightly. Yi Lang looked at the guard, and smiled. "What's your name?" The guard hurriedly bowed. "Subordinate Zhang Mu greets the prince." Yi Lang nodded. "You're not bad. After I become the prince, I need 10 guards. You can be my guard from now on." Hearing this, Zhang Mu was overjoyed, and hurriedly bowed deeply. "This subordinate is willing to go through fire and water for the prince, even if it means death." Yi Lang nodded slightly. "Drag him out. This person is disturbing the ancestral hall. Don't show mercy, understand?" Zhang Mu glanced at Yi Lang, and when he saw the murderous intent in Yi Lang's eyes, he understood. He immediately grabbed Yi Ling's hair and dragged her out. At this moment, Zhang Mu seemed to see something, and suddenly stopped. In the ancestral hall, everyone turned their heads to look outside. Not far from the ancestral hall, a young man was walking towards the ancestral hall. The young man was wearing a tight-fitting robe, and the robe was tattered, and there was blood everywhere. The young man was Yi Xian, who had rushed back from Nanshan. Seeing Yi Xian, Yi Lang's lips curled into a sinister smile. Inside the ancestral hall, the elders frowned. The great elder narrowed his eyes, and his face darkened. No one knew what he was thinking. From afar, when Yi Xian saw Zhang Mu dragging Yi Ling, his face turned savage. "Who gave you the guts to touch my sister?" When Zhang Mu saw Yi Xian, his face changed. He hurriedly looked at Yi Lang, and just as he was about to speak, Yi Xian leaped in front of him like a ferocious tiger. Before the latter could react, Yi Xian's fist landed on his face. Pung! Zhang Mu felt a wave of dizziness, and he stumbled and fell. However, Yi Ling did not stop there, and charged towards Zhang Mu once more. At this time, Yi Lang suddenly roared, "Yi Xian, he's my man, how dare you!" Yi Xian suddenly stepped on Zhang Mu's chest. Pooh! Zhang Mu spat out a mouthful of blood. Seeing this, Yi Lang's face turned ugly. Yi Xian looked up at him, and snarled, "Your man?" As he spoke, he stepped on Zhang Mu's face. Zhang Mu's face turned into a bloody mess, as he screamed, "Prince, save me." Yi Xian did not care about Zhang Mu, as he walked to Yi Ling's side. Seeing Yi Ling's state, Yi Xian felt as though his heart was being sliced by a knife. He clenched his fists, and his entire body trembled. When Yi Ling saw Yi Xian, her tears flowed out. "Brother, it hurts, it hurts." Hearing this, Yi Xian's expression turned savage. In the next instant, he charged in front of Zhang Mu, and kicked Zhang Mu's head. Pung! Chapter 1787. Sword Dao Intent. After Yi Xian withdrew the green-clothed man's sword Dao Intent, the mysterious sword Dao Intent in the distance started trembling slightly, and it seemed to be fearful. Yi Xian was quite shocked as he gazed at the mysterious sword Dao Intent. How formidable! This sword Dao Intent wasn't as strong as his father's, but it was much stronger than his own. So, he couldn't devour it at all. There really was always someone stronger in this world. Xiao Linlang, who stood by Yi Xian's side, took a deep and long glance at Yi Xian. The sword Dao Intent in Yi Xian's hand made her feel even more dangerous. Meanwhile, Yi Xian walked towards the mysterious sword Dao Intent in the distance, but the sword Dao Intent immediately retreated. This wasn't fear any longer, it was fear. Yi Xian stopped and gazed at the sword Dao Intent in his hand. "Father, you're amazing." As he spoke, he gazed at the sword Dao Intent. "I presume you have a spirit. Can we have a chat?" Meanwhile, the mysterious sword Dao Intent had suddenly transformed into a woman. The woman wore a white dress and had a petite figure. She just stared at Yi Xian with a vigilant gaze. Yi Xian smiled. "Miss, what's your name?" The woman glanced at the strand of sword Dao Intent in Yi Xian's hand and didn't speak. Yi Xian smiled. "I'm Yi Xian." As he spoke, he put the sword Dao Intent away. After he did, he noticed that the woman's expression had become much more relaxed. Yi Xian asked, "Miss, what's your name?" The woman glanced at Yi Xian. "I don't have a name." "I don't have a name." Yi Xian thought for a moment, and then he said, "Then I'll give you one. You'll be called Ling Shi. What do you think?" The woman was speechless. Jinxin and Xiao Linlang gazed at Yi Xian as if they were looking at a monster. Yi Xian grinned. "Miss Ling Shi, are you alone?" The woman looked at Yi Xian. "Outsiders are not allowed in here." Yi Xian was puzzled. "Why?" The woman said nothing. Yi Xian glanced at the mountain range in the distance. "Can I go in?" The woman immediately shook her head. Yi Xian thought for a moment, then he walked in front of the woman. He took out a stick of candied hawthorn and gave it to the woman. "Try it?" Leng Xinxin and Xiao Linlang were dumbfounded. What was going on? The woman glanced at the candied fruit in Yi Xian's hand and said, "What's that?" Yi Xian said seriously, "An ancient god-grade spirit item, have a taste." The woman hesitated for a moment, then took the candied fruit. She opened the wrapper and gently licked it. She frowned slightly, as if she felt that it was not bad. She licked it again. Yi Xian asked softly, "Is it delicious?" The woman took a look at the tanghulu and then looked at Yi Xian. "Delicious." Ling Xinxin, Xiao Linlang, Yi Xian said with a smile, "Ling Shi, how long have you been here?" Ling Shi licked the candied hawthorn, and then she shook her head. "I don't remember." Yi Xian smiled. "Then have you ever thought of leaving?" Ling Shi shook her head. Yi Xian was puzzled. "Why?" Ling Shi said, "Master asked me to stand guard here and not let anyone in." Yi Xian was slightly curious. "Where's your master?" Ling Shi turned to look at the mountain range. "In there." Yi Xian hesitated for a moment, and then he said, "Is she still alive?" Ling Shi shook her head. "I don't know." Yi Xian glanced at the mountain range. "Can I go in?" Ling Shi immediately shook her head. Master said that no one can go in. Yi Xian blinked. Did she say that your friends can't go in? Ling Shi looked at Yi Xian. Friends? Yi Xian nodded. We're friends, right? Ling Shi hesitated for a moment, and then she said, What's a friend? Yi Xian was speechless. This little girl has probably never been to the outside world at all. She's like a blank piece of paper. Yi Xian thought for a moment, and then he withdrew a skewer of candied hawthorn and passed it to Ling Shi. She didn't refuse and just took it. Yi Xian smiled. What do you think of me? Ling Shi gazed at Yi Xian and didn't speak. Yi Xian withdrew another skewer of candied hawthorn and passed it to her. Ling Shi hesitated for a moment, and then she took it and said, A good person. A good person. The nearby Ling Xinxin and Xiao Linlang were dumbstruck when they heard this. She's a good person? That's possible? Yi Xian smiled. Ling Shi, do you want to meet your master? Ling Shi immediately nodded. Yes. Yi Xian grinned. Then let's go see him. All right? Ling Shi hesitated for a moment, and then she shook her head. He asked me to stand on guard here. Yi Xian asked. Did he say that he wouldn't allow you to leave? Ling Shi's brows knit together slightly. After a short moment, she shook her head. No. Yi Xian roared with laughter. Then let's go look for him. As soon as he finished speaking, he grabbed Ling Shi's arm and walked towards the distance. Ling Shi was slightly resistant at the beginning, but she didn't continue after she struggled to no avail. Ling Xinxin and Xiao Linlang were stunned behind them. Xiao Linlang remained silent for a short moment before she said, Is it done just like that? Ling Xinxin gazed at Yi Xian who stood in the distance. Amazing. Xiao Linlang laughed bitterly. Every time they came here, they would be suppressed by the sword Dao intent here. It wasn't just her, many others were stopped here as well. Because the sword Dao intent was truly too strong, and even a great saint didn't dare go head-on against it. Yet at this moment, Yi Xian had resolved it with a few skewers of candied hawthorn. Xiao Linlang's smile grew even more bitter when she thought up to here. If I knew this would happen, I would have bought some candied hawthorn. Meanwhile, Ling Xinxin suddenly said, Let's go. Let's go take a look at this mysterious place. As she spoke, she started walking towards the distance. Xiao Linlang shook her head and followed her as well. Ling Shi was slightly anxious in the distance. Yi Xian smiled, Your master won't blame you. Ling Shi turned around to gaze at Yi Xian. She hesitated for a moment before she said, Master's temper isn't really good. I'm very afraid that she'll get angry. Yi Xian spoke softly, You've definitely been standing guard there for a very long time, right? Ling Shi shook her head. I don't remember. Yi Xian sighed softly in his heart. Once anything had intelligence, it was equivalent to having a life of its own. Even if it was a strand of sword Dao intent. Presently, Ling Shi wasn't merely a strand of sword Dao intent. Just like Qing had merely been a clone all those years ago. But what happened in the end? Her strength had far surpassed her main body. Once she possessed intelligence, then she would have a limitless future. It didn't take long for them to arrive at the depths of the mountain range. There was a door there, and there were 3 words inscribed on it, Ruins of Sword Sect. The Ruins of Sword Sect. Up the door was a limestone staircase that stretched on endlessly. Yi Xian was just about to enter, but Ling Shi stopped on the spot and didn't dare enter. Yi Xian smiled, It's fine. If your master gets angry, then I'll stop him for you. Ling Shi glanced at Yi Xian, Master is very strong. You won't be able to stop him. Yi Xian said with a smile, Do you want to see your master? Ling Shi nodded. Yi Xian said, Then let's go. As soon as he finished speaking, he pulled Ling Shi up the mountain. It didn't take long for them to arrive at the peak of the mountain. There was an enormous palace there, and there were countless other halls in the mountain range behind the palace. The ruins of Sword Sect was clearly extraordinary based on its scale. On the other hand, Yi Xian sensed numerous remnant strands of sword qi and sword Dao intent in the ruins of Sword Sect. However, they weren't as strong as Ling Shi. Yi Xian led Ling Shi towards a hall in the distance. Meanwhile, Ling Shi suddenly stopped and spoke in a trembling voice, "Master's aura. Master's aura." Yi Xian gazed at the hall in the distance. "He's in there?" Ling Shi nodded, "Yes, yes." Yi Xian grinned, "Let's go take a look." As he spoke, he pulled Ling Shi towards the hall. Ling Shi spoke with a trembling voice, I'm afraid." Yi Xian frowned slightly. Something isn't right. Logically speaking, the sword Dao intent belongs to that mysterious expert, so it shouldn't be so afraid of him. Meanwhile, Xiao Linlang suddenly spoke solemnly, "Be careful." Yi Xian nodded. At this moment, he felt that the atmosphere was slightly off as well. He gazed at the hall in the distance, and he fell silent for a short moment before he said, "We're already here. Let's go take a look." As he spoke, he led the three of them over to the hall. There was an incomplete statue before the hall. The upper half of the statue had fallen to the ground, and the cut was smooth like a mirror. Obviously, it had been slashed apart by a sword. A woman was sitting on the ground within the hall. Her long hair hung loosely on her shoulders, and she just sat there without moving at all. Her hair was white. Besides that, a man was lying on the ground in front of her, and he was completely devoid of any aura. Ling Shi spoke in a trembling voice when she saw the woman, "Master. Master." The woman didn't answer her. Yi Xian spoke softly, "Senior?" Right at this moment, the woman suddenly opened her palm. The green profound sword flew out from within Yi Xian's body and fell into her grasp. She gazed at it for a long time before she said, "Who forged this sword?" Yi Xian hesitated for a moment before he said, "My younger sister." The woman stood up, turned around, and walked over to Yi Xian. "Your younger sister?" Yi Xian nodded, "Yes." The woman stared at Yi Xian for a short while before she said, "Do you need something?" Yi Xian hesitated for a moment before he said, "I came here to look for a master." The woman said, "I don't teach anyone." As soon as she finished speaking, she let go of the sword, and it returned to Yi Xian's grasp. After that, she turned around, walked over to the meditation cushion, and sat down without speaking another word. Yi Xian was speechless. Meanwhile, Xiao Linlang suddenly said, "Why don't you try using candied fruits?" Yi Xian's face darkened. Try using candied fruits? He didn't want to be beaten to death. Yi Xian thought for a moment, and then he said, "Then I'll be taking my leave." As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and left. Since she didn't want to teach him, then he would definitely not shamelessly beg her. The main reason was that she didn't seem like someone who was easy to talk to. He might be able to deal with her if she was a single woman, but she clearly had a close relationship with the man on the ground. Suddenly, the man in front of the woman said, "Young friend, save me. Save me." As soon as these words were spoken, Yi Xian was stunned. He turned around to look at the man on the ground, but the man's eyes were slightly closed and didn't move at all. There was no aura. Meanwhile, another voice resounded from within the man's body, "Young friend, save me." Chapter 1788. Yi Xian glanced at the man. He was sure this man did not have any aura. Xiao Linlang suddenly exclaimed, "Soul! Soul!" Yi Xian looked at Xiao Linlang. Xiao Linlang stared fixedly at the man. "His soul is sealed inside his body." Yi Xian turned his head to look at the man. He took a closer look at the man. Soon, he found that there was indeed a soul in the man's body. The white-haired woman beside him remained calm, not saying a word. Yi Xian felt awkward. This was obviously done by this woman. Why would she do that? He did not dare to ask too many questions. Yi Xian collected his thoughts. Let's go. It was better not to meddle in other people's business. Xiao Linlang nodded hastily. She also wanted to leave. This white-haired woman's sword will was already so terrifying, how could her body not be heaven-defying? Up until now, she still could not sense this white-haired woman's aura. She might have already reached the ancient god realm. Just as the three of them were about to leave, the man's voice sounded again, "Little friend, please wait." Yi Xian quickened his pace. What a joke, he did not want to meddle in other people's business. At this time, the body suddenly trembled violently, and the man's voice sounded again, "Little friend, please save me. I beg you. If little friend is willing to help, I am willing to give you all the sword skills and mantras of the ruins of Sword Sect." Yi Xian pretended not to hear. The white-haired woman suddenly said, "Wait." Yi Xian's footsteps halted, and he turned to the white-haired woman with a smile, "Senior, this is your business, it has nothing to do with me." The white-haired woman looked at Yi Xian. "Wait." Yi Xian, the white-haired woman looked at the man in front of her, and she lightly tapped his forehead. Boom! A soul floated out from the body. The white-haired woman looked at the man's soul. "Do you really not want to be with me?" The man smiled bitterly. "Yi, can you let me go? You've already imprisoned me for tens of thousands of years. What else do you want?" The white-haired woman glared at the man. "Didn't you tell me that you would always be with me? Aren't we together now?" The man spoke in a deep voice. "Yi, I know that I have let you down. But you've already imprisoned me for 10,000 years. Isn't that enough?" "How is that enough?" The woman suddenly roared. Boom! The entire hall exploded, and Yi Xian and the other two were sent flying several thousand zhang away. The powerful sword qi wreaked havoc between the heavens and the earth, as if it wanted to cut the heavens and the earth into pieces. It was extremely terrifying. Yi Xian stared at the woman in the distance, completely dumbfounded. So fierce. At this moment, there were no less than a dozen sword wounds on his body. His invincible sword body actually failed at this moment. This woman's attainments in the sword Dao were more than 10 times more terrifying than he had imagined. Beside Yi Xian, Xiao Linlang's expression was solemn like never before. This woman's cultivation was at least ancient god realm. Not only that, but she was also a swordsman. In the distance, the woman glared fixedly at the man, her eyes scarlet. 10,000 years? Do you think that's enough? Do you think it's enough? The man roared, "If you think it's not enough, then kill me. I beg you, kill me. Don't torture me." The woman sneered, "Kill you? Isn't that too easy for you?" The man roared, "What do you want?" The woman glared at the man, "I want you to wish you were dead." The man spat venomously, "I betrayed you. I betrayed you. Because I don't love you, I never loved you. I was only with you because I wanted to toy with you." The woman's expression was strangely calm. "Don't worry, I won't kill you." Ah! The man completely collapsed. At the side, Yi Xian hesitated for a moment before saying, "Senior, I still have matters to attend to. We'll be taking our leave." With that said, he turned and ran. It was better not to get involved in such matters of the heart. Right at this moment, a strand of sword force locked onto Yi Xian. Yi Xian said helplessly, "Senior, I don't really want to interfere in your matters." The white-haired woman gazed at Yi Xian. "I didn't ask you to interfere." Yi Xian was slightly puzzled. "Then what do you mean, senior?" The white-haired woman took a step forward, and she'd arrived in front of Yi Xian as soon as her foot descended. Yi Xian was secretly on guard. The white-haired woman stared at Yi Xian. "Help me do something." Yi Xian hesitated for a moment before he said, "Tell me what it is." The white-haired woman opened her palm, and a wooden token appeared in her hand. Yi Xian was slightly curious. "What's this?" The white-haired woman gazed at the wooden token in her hand. "Soul wood." Yi Xian spoke in a low voice. There's a soul in there? The white-haired woman said, my sons. Yi Xian, in the distance, the man suddenly said in a trembling voice, you, what did you say? The white-haired woman turned to look at the man, her expression unusually cold. Surprised? Surprised? The man said in a trembling voice, you didn't kill our son back then. Yi Xian was speechless. Damn it. What kind of weird family was this? It was comparable to Tianye's family. Thinking of Tianye, Yi Xian couldn't help but curse. What kind of stupid thing is this? Tianye, out of so many enemies, only Tianye had left a deep impression on him. The white-haired woman looked at the man. That's my son. The man walked in front of the white-haired woman, his throat rolling. I was wrong. I was really wrong. You can do whatever you want to me, just let our son go, okay? The white-haired woman looked at the man in front of her. I used to love you so much. For you, I gave up the position of the family's heir, and was willing to roam the world with you, but what about you? When I was pregnant, you hooked up with your sex junior sister. Saying this, she smiled sadly. I was really blind. Hearing this, Yi Xian couldn't help but look at the man. Damn, this man was too much of a scumbag. How could he do such a thing? The man hurriedly said, it's my fault, I let you down. Thousands of mistakes, it's all my fault, you, just let our son go, okay? The white-haired woman looked at the man. I feel that his life in this world is a kind of pain. The man directly knelt down. You, please let him go. He's innocent. This is an adult's matter, not a child should be involved. Saying this, he fiercely kowtowed. At the side, Yi Xian couldn't help but say, Senior, can I say a few words? The white-haired woman turned to look at Yi Xian, and Yi Xian said in a deep voice, I can understand your feelings, but the matter between adults really shouldn't involve a child. I know a friend, his name is God Yi, and his father is just like this man in front of you, a real bastard. And because of his parents, his life has been miserable. Worse than mine. So, if you want to punish this heartless man, I don't think it's a problem. But it shouldn't involve the child. Parents quarrel, the child suffers. With all due respect, such parents are simply trash. The man at the side quickly said, this little brother is right. If you're angry, punish me. I'm willing to be imprisoned by you forever, just let the child go, okay? After a long silence, the white-haired woman placed the soul tablet in front of Yi Xian. Yi Xian was a little puzzled. This? The white-haired woman looked at Yi Xian. Help me find a good home for him, let him rebuild his physical body, and live an ordinary life. Hearing that, the man at the side suddenly breathed a sigh of relief, and his entire body went limp. Yi Xian said in a deep voice, Senior, won't you accompany him to grow up? The white-haired woman slowly closed her eyes. I don't want to, and I don't dare. Because when I see him, I can't stop the hatred in my heart. I'll hurt him. Yi Xian sighed in his heart. He suddenly thought of God Ye's mother, Yi Lingtian. She was also a woman who had been hurt by love, and she was also so extreme. Do all women become extreme after being scum? Yi Xian sighed again. I have to pay attention to my relationships in the future. Otherwise, it might be a big problem in the future. I can't have too many wives. 10 or so should be enough. At that moment, the white-haired woman suddenly said, in return, I'll teach you everything I've learned in my life. Yi Xian smiled, Senior, even if you don't teach me your sword techniques, I'll still help you. The white-haired woman nodded slightly, and then she pressed her fingers together and pointed. An array of white light entered the space between Yi Xian's brows. Boom! In an instant, countless pieces of information surged into Yi Xian's mind. A moment later, the white-haired woman withdrew her right hand, looked up at the horizon, and said, started cultivating the sword at the age of 20, and was invincible at the age of 30. I've never met a worthy opponent in my entire life. With a sword in hand, I'm invincible. As she spoke, she looked at the green profound sword in Yi Xian's hand, and a strong desire to fight flashed in her eyes. After seeing this sword today, I finally know that such a powerful swordsman exists in the world. I want to fight the person who created this sword. Fight Qing. Yi Xian said in a deep voice, Senior, I don't know where she is. The white-haired woman smiled, I'll do it. As soon as she finished speaking, she opened her palm, and the green profound sword appeared in her hand. She slowly closed her eyes, and the green profound sword trembled violently in her hand. A short moment later, the white-haired woman suddenly looked up at the horizon. I found her. Found her? Yi Xian looked up into the sky, but he saw nothing. At some unknown place, a woman had suddenly stopped. It was the woman in a plain dress. She tilted her head slightly, and she seemed to be looking at something. The white-haired woman smiled proudly in front of the mausoleum of swords. No one has ever been able to withstand a single strike of my sword since I achieved success in the Tao of the sword. Be careful, Your Excellency. As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly took a step forward and slashed with her sword. The sword splits the universe. Hiss. In an instant, an enormous rift with no end in sight appeared in the sky. This sword strike couldn't be stopped by time, space, or the laws of the universe. It had directly split the entire universe apart. Meanwhile, a shadow slashed down from the sky above the woman in a plain dress. As soon as the sword slashed down, the star region around the woman in a plain dress started to burn. P.S. It erupted prematurely. Because of yesterday's update, I was cursed so badly. It's fine if they scolded me. They even scolded my family, and they scolded me viciously. That kind of feeling is really hard to understand. It only takes 2 minutes to read a few chapters, but it takes a whole day to write. I can really understand if they're unhappy with it and complain a little. But scolding my whole family, I really can't understand it. How much hatred does one have to scold people with such vicious words? Some people's hearts are really scary. If you don't do what they want, they really want you to go to hell. Chapter 1789. Yi Xian's expression changed at the instant the white-haired woman attacked. At this moment, he finally realized that he'd underestimated the white-haired woman. He'd severely underestimated her. Her attainments in the sword Tao were much more formidable than he'd imagined. Yi Xian looked up, but he couldn't see Qing at all. With his current strength, it was impossible for his naked eye to traverse through stellar regions. The woman in a plain dress gazed at the image that slashed towards her, and a wisp of disdain arose on the corners of her mouth. What a waste of my time. As soon as she finished speaking, she drew her sword and slashed, and then she turned around and left. Hiss. The image shattered. In the next moment, not too far away from Yi Xian, a ray of light pierced through the center of the white-haired woman's forehead. Bang! The white-haired woman's figure vanished bit by bit. Instant kill. The white-haired woman's gaze was slightly dazed as she stood before Yi Xian. She'd been instantly killed. Yi Xian remained silent. Qing had won. Moreover, it was the invincible Qing. On the other hand, Ling Xinxin and Xiao Linlang were beyond shocked. The person behind Yi Xian had instantly killed the white-haired woman. Moreover, they were countless stellar regions apart. Right at this moment, the white-haired woman who stood before Yi Xian spoke softly. What's her name? Yi Xian glanced at the white-haired woman. Tianming. Tianming. The white-haired woman muttered, how formidable. Yi Xian glanced at the ray of light between her brows, and he hesitated for a moment before he said, would you be able to live if I retract that ray of light? The white-haired woman shook her head, I'm already dead. Yi Xian sighed softly. He knew that Qing wasn't like his older brother. He knew that Qing was different from his older brother. The white-haired woman suddenly smiled, that's fine as well. Yi Xian looked at the white-haired woman. The white-haired woman softly said, "As a swordsman, dying by the sword is the best ending for a swordsman." As she spoke, she looked at the soul wood token in Yi Xian's hand. "Please." With that, she slowly closed her eyes. At this moment, her body was disappearing at a speed visible to the naked eye. At this time, the man beside her suddenly said in a trembling voice, "Ah-ee. I'm sorry." The woman did not open her eyes, nor did she reply. Directly ignored. Gradually, the woman disappeared bit by bit. Soon, the woman completely disappeared. After she completely disappeared, a jade hairpin slowly fell to the ground. When he saw the jade hairpin, the man felt as if he had suffered a heavy blow. In an instant, countless scenes surged into his mind. "Ai, do you like this jade hairpin?" "I like it." "Ah-ee is the most beautiful person in the world. I don't deserve you, Lin Lang. I will only marry you in this life." "But uncle doesn't agree." "Then I'll go with you." "You're the crown prince, not even 1/10,000th of Lin Lang. I will not let you down in this life." In front of Yi Xian, the man looked as if he had lost his soul. After a while, he started laughing, and crying. Yi Xian sighed softly. Perhaps the two of them had really been in love. However, the man in front of him had still let Ai down in the end. At this moment, the man suddenly looked at Yi Xian. He opened his palm, and an illusory Xiao Ta floated in front of Yi Xian. Yi Xian was a little puzzled. "Senior, this is?" The man said, "All the treasures of the ruins of Sword Sect." "Little brother, it's yours now." After a moment of silence, Yi Xian said, "She didn't kill you, which means that the man shook his head. "You don't understand. She didn't kill me not because she still loves me, but because she has let go of me." Yi Xian sighed again. The man glanced at the wood soul token in Yi Xian's hand. "Little brother, please." As he spoke, his soul directly ignited. Seeing this scene, Yi Xian's expression suddenly changed. He hurriedly said, "Senior, you." The man looked at the jade hairpin in his hand and said softly, "I owe her." As he spoke, his entire soul directly ignited. In less than a few breaths, it was completely incinerated. Dead. Yi Xian and the other two were silent. After a long time, Xiao Linlang suddenly said, "This is not a bad thing for them." Ling Xinxin nodded. "The two of them are torturing each other as long as they are alive." Yi Xian nodded slightly. "Indeed." At this moment, Ling Xinxin suddenly looked at Yi Xian. "You have to be careful." Yi Xian was a little confused. "What about me?" Ling Xinxin said, "It's very easy for you to win a woman's heart with your flowery ways. Don't deceive a woman's feelings for no good reason in the future." Yi Xian was speechless. Yi Xian was just about to speak when he seemed to have thought of something, and he suddenly turned around. Ling Shi was standing not too far away, and tears were flowing incessantly from her face. Ling Shi. The white-haired woman's sword Dao intent. Yi Xian walked over to Ling Shi, hesitated for a moment, and then said, "Don't cry. To her, she has been freed." Ling Shi lowered her head slightly, and her voice trembled as she said, "What should I do now?" Yi Xian smiled, "Why don't you come with me?" Ling Shi gazed at Yi Xian. Yi Xian smiled, "Are you willing?" Ling Shi was slightly hesitant. Yi Xian added, "You have as many candied haws as you want." Ling Shi immediately nodded, "Yes." Yi Xian was quite speechless. "I'm actually not as charming as candied haws." Xiao Linlang was even more speechless. This fellow actually tricked a little girl who's comparable to a great saint just like that. Even though Ling Shi was only a strand of sword Dao intent, her strength was sufficient to kill a great saint. Ordinary great saints couldn't compare to her at all. Besides that, this fellow had even obtained the inheritance of the white-haired woman's sword Dao. Most importantly, Yi Xian had obtained all the treasures of the ruins of Sword Sect. How terrifying were the treasures of an entire sect. What a huge profit. Even though she wanted it as well, she didn't have the qualifications. After all, those two only acknowledged Yi Xian. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly smiled. Miss Xinxin, Miss Linlang, let's go. Both of them nodded. Right at this moment, Yi Xian suddenly withdrew a spatial ring and passed it to Xiao Linlang. Miss Linlang, this is for you. Xiao Linlang glanced at it, and there were over 1,000,000 eternal divine crystals within the spatial ring. Those were eternal divine crystals. Even a great saint would need them for cultivation. Not to mention an individual, even a super force like the great spiritual god Palace might not be able to gather over 1,000,000 eternal divine crystals in a short period of time. Xiao Linlang looked at Yi Xian. You're giving them to me? Yi Xian smiled. We're friends, aren't we? After looking at Yi Xian for a long time, Xiao Linlang smiled. I understand. Then, she put away the spatial ring. Yi Xian laughed heartily. At this moment, Ling Xinxin suddenly extended her hand. What about mine? Yi Xian was speechless. You're really not holding back. Yi Xian looked at Ling Xinxin and smiled. Xinxin, I need you to do something for me. Ling Xinxin asked, what is it? Yi Xian said in a deep voice, I need you to return to the Sword Alliance. Ling Xinxin asked, for what? Yi Xian smiled, to bring things back. He had just obtained all the treasures of the entire ruins of Sword Sect, including all the cultivation methods and sword skills. These things were too suitable for the current Sword Alliance. Although the Sword Alliance was his father's, he was just a hands-off boss. He let the Sword Alliance roam freely. Therefore, the people of the Sword Alliance could only rely on themselves. Now, the cultivation methods and martial skills of the ruins of Sword Sect were extremely top-notch. If they were given to the Sword Alliance, it would definitely produce a large number of minor saints and even great saints. Currently, the strength of the ruins of Sword Sect was definitely above that of the great spiritual god Palace. And the ruins of Sword Sect was obviously destroyed by the white-haired woman. Yi Xian sighed in his heart. The white-haired woman was the strongest swordsman he had seen so far apart from his father, Qing, and his big brother. He felt that if the sword she used to challenge Qing had been aimed at the ancient god galaxy, the entire ancient god galaxy would have been destroyed. Unfortunately, the person she had challenged was Qing, the invincible Qing, Yi Xian collected his thoughts and handed a storage ring to Jianxin. I've already kept everything that suits me. Bring the rest to the Sword Alliance. Then tell Sword Maniac and Sword Ju to quickly improve. I have a lot of enemies in the ancient god galaxy. Ask them to help me fight in the future. Xiao Linlang was speechless. Jianxin glanced at Yi Xian. You're giving them all to the Sword Alliance? Yi Xian rolled his eyes at Jianxin. What do you mean? Do I still need to differentiate between the Sword Alliance and myself? Jianxin put away the storage ring. Take care. Then, she turned and left. After a few steps, she seemed to have thought of something and stopped. Then, she turned to look at Yi Xian. The sword you took out just now is not bad. Do you want to give it to me? Yi Xian was stunned. Then, he took out the green profound sword. This one? Jianxin nodded. Do you want to give it to me? Yi Xian's face darkened. This woman actually wanted his green profound sword. Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. He pointed his finger and the green profound sword appeared in front of Jianxin. Jianxin did not stand on ceremony. She held the sword and waved it lightly. However, nothing happened. Jianxin frowned. What's going on? She held the sword as if it was an ordinary sword. Yi Xian smiled. When Qing forged this sword, he told me that only I can use it. Jianxin pouted. Then, she threw the sword to Yi Xian. Remember, you still owe me a sword. Then, she turned and flew away on her sword. Yi Xian suddenly said, "There are many good swords in the storage ring. You can choose first." At the end of the horizon, Jinxin said, "Do I need you to tell me?" Yi Xian was speechless. At this moment, Xiao Linlang's expression suddenly changed. She looked into the distance. "A lot of people are coming." Yi Xian looked into the distance. Indeed, there were many powerful auras rushing over. Xiao Linlang said solemnly, "Without the suppression of Sword Dao willpower, anyone can enter this place." Yi Xian said, "Miss Linlang, please cooperate with me later." Xiao Linlang looked at Yi Xian. "What do you mean?" Yi Xian suddenly punched himself in the chest. "Pooh!" Yi Xian spat out a mouthful of blood essence. Xiao Linlang was shocked. "You," Yi Xian suddenly roared, "Little grotto heaven, you actually stole all the treasures." With that, he punched himself in the chest again. Puff! Another stream of blood sprayed out. Xiao Linlang's jaw dropped as he watched on. Chapter 1790. Suddenly, a group of people appeared here. The weakest amongst them was at the spacetime realm. The black-robed man who led the group possessed an unfathomable aura. Xiao Linlang frowned slightly when she saw the black-robed man, Wang Zhan. Wang Zhan. An extraordinary genius of the Battle God Pavilion who was equally famous as Li Yaoye. Wang Zhan was slightly stunned when he saw Xiao Linlang, and then he said, "Miss Linlang, you're here as well?" Xiao Linlang grinned, "I never expected that Brother Wang would be here as well." Wang Zhan glanced at Yi Xian, "Miss Linlang, this is..." Xiao Linlang replied, "He's Yi Xian." Yi Xian. Wang Zhan was slightly stunned. He'd naturally heard of Yi Xian's name. After all, Yi Xian had killed inner court disciples and elite disciples in the Great Spirit God Palace. But now, Yi Xian had been expelled from the Great Spirit God Palace. Wang Zhan sized up Yi Xian and said, "Brother Yi is injured?" Yi Xian wiped off the blood on the corner of his mouth and nodded, "Yes." As he spoke, he clenched his fists tightly and had a ferocious expression on his face. "The tiny abode is truly detestable. They actually took all the divine artifacts from the ruins of Sword Sect and kept them to themselves. How infuriating." Wang Zhan and the others behind him had quite unsightly expressions on their faces. They were too late. They'd rushed over as soon as they found out that the intent of the Sword Dao had vanished, but they hadn't expected that they would actually be too late. Meanwhile, Wang Zhan suddenly asked, "Someone from the tiny abode came?" Yi Xian nodded, "Yes. Quite a few came. They seized all the treasures of the ruins of Sword Sect. They even wanted to kill me to keep me quiet. I would have been dead if Miss Linlang hadn't arrived in time." Wang Zhan turned around to gaze at Xiao Linlang. She hesitated for a moment before she nodded. She'd just taken 1,000,000 eternal divine crystals from them, so she had no choice but to cooperate. The faces of Wang Zhan and the others fell when they heard Xiao Linlang. They were really too late. Right at this moment, an extremely terrifying aura suddenly swept over from the horizon. Great Sage. Everyone turned their heads to look at the sky. The sky had suddenly split apart, and then an old man walked out slowly. As soon as the old man appeared, his gaze immediately fell on Yi Xian. "Yi Xian!" Yi Xian shouted angrily, "Little cave heaven. Aren't you going to let it go after snatching the treasure?" The old man frowned. "What are you talking about?" Yi Xian glared at the old man. "You're still playing dumb." Meanwhile, everyone in the surroundings gazed at the old man. Although the old man was a great sage, they were not afraid of him. After all, there were many people. In the sky, the old man stared at Yi Xian. "What are you talking about?" Yi Xian said angrily, "Old man, you're still playing dumb." As he spoke, he tore off his clothes. Beneath his clothes, his chest had already split open and was still bleeding. Yi Xian stared at the old man and spoke with grief and indignation. I don't want the 100 million eternal divine crystals and 50 divine rank springs of eternal life from the ruins of Sword. I don't want them, alright? Why do you have to be so ruthless? As soon as these words were spoken, everyone in the surroundings was stunned. 100 million eternal divine crystals. 50 divine rank springs of eternal life. Everyone's heads were buzzing. Meanwhile, Yi Xian continued, and those divine weapons and treasures that surpass the ancient god rank. I don't want them anymore. I don't want them anymore. They belong to your little cave heaven. You. Please let me go. The old man spoke angrily. Kid, what are you playing at? When did my little cave heaven obtain those things? You. Yi Xian hurriedly said, no. I misspoke. Yes, your little cave heaven didn't obtain those things. I misremembered. I'm sorry, I misremembered. The old man was speechless. At this moment, the gazes of everyone here had shot towards the old man. Wang Zhan gazed at the old man. I never expected that the little cave heaven would be able to destroy that sword Dao intent. Amazing. The old man looked coldly at the website. Are you brainless? He's clearly framing you, yet you believe him? The corners of Wang Zhan's mouth curled up slightly. Are you saying that I'm brainless? The old man stared at Wang Zhan. If you are, then would you believe him? Wang Zhan gazed at the old man. He's a swordsman, and swordsman cultivates the heart. I don't believe that a swordsman would go against his conscience and lie. Of course, that's not important now. The important thing is that I don't like you at all. As he spoke, he suddenly leaped up and smashed his fist forward. The aura of his fist instantly enveloped the entire world. The old man's expression instantly changed when he saw this punch. He didn't dare act carelessly, so he took a step forward and smashed his fist forward. The power of a saint. With this punch, the entire world became illusory. Bang! A world-shaking explosion suddenly resounded in the sky, and then the old man retreated explosively. However, Wang Zhan hadn't taken a single step back. Wang Zhan had won this collision. The old man was extremely shocked as he gazed at Wang Zhan. Who are you? A wisp of a cold smile arose on the corners of Wang Zhan's mouth. I'm your fucking ancestor. As he spoke, he charged forward. Bang! As soon as he charged forward, a strand of powerful aura enveloped the old man, and then the space around the old man instantly started burning. The old man was horrified, and he hurriedly took a step forward while he clenched his right hand into a fist, and then he smashed his fist forward. Bang! A golden image flashed into appearance on his fist. Meanwhile, Wang Zhan's fist had arrived. Rumble. In an instant, the entire world trembled violently. The spectators watched as the old man retreated explosively by over 3 kilometers. Moreover, his entire body split apart as soon as he stopped moving, and only his soul remained. However, Wang Zhan hadn't taken a single step back. Yi Xian glanced at Wang Zhan. He had to admit that the super geniuses of the ancient god galaxy were all extremely terrifying. Wang Zhan was at the minor saint realm, but his strength had completely crushed the old man who was at the saint realm. In the distance, the old man who only had his soul left was slightly stunned. My body is gone. It's gone just like that? As if he had thought of something, he suddenly looked at Wang Zhan and roared furiously. Do you know who I am? I'm from the small cave world. Wang Zhan was about to speak when Yi Xian suddenly said, Old man, do you know who this person is? He's the #1 super genius in the ancient god galaxy, Wang Zhan. As he spoke, he looked at Wang Zhan with eyes filled with admiration. I've heard that Brother Wang is the #1 genius in the ancient god galaxy. It's my honor to meet you today. At the side, Xiao Linlang glanced at Yi Xian with a trace of vigilance in her eyes. She was very clear about Yi Xian's strength, and he was absolutely not weaker than Wang Zhan. However, in front of Wang Zhan, he acted as if he was not as good as Wang Zhan. He was too scheming. He was so good at playing dirty tricks. Was this guy really a swordsman? Not far away, when Wang Zhan heard Yi Xian's words, he was slightly stunned, then he smiled and said, "Brother Yi, you're too polite. As far as I know, Brother Yi is also a super genius." Yi Xian shook his head and smiled bitterly. "Before I met Brother Wang, I also thought I was a super genius, but now," as he spoke, he sighed in a low voice, "after meeting Brother Wang, I finally understood that there's always someone better than you. If there's a chance in the future, I'd like to learn from Brother Wang." Wang Zhan laughed, "I don't deserve to learn from you, but we can exchange some pointers." Yi Xian quickly said, "I don't dare to exchange pointers. If Brother Wang can give me some pointers, I'll benefit a lot." Xiao Linlang stared at Yi Xian. "How can you be so pretentious?" In the sky, Wang Zhan smiled and said, "Brother Yi, previously the people from Great Spiritual God Palace said that you're extremely arrogant, but I feel that you're quite an honest person. It seems that the rumors can't be trusted." Yi Xian smiled slightly. "In this world, no one has the qualifications to be arrogant in front of Brother Wang. Everyone, this boot-licking." Xiao Linlang's eyes were slowly closing. She couldn't stand it anymore. Wang Zhan, on the other hand, laughed out loud. Being flattered by ordinary people made him feel disgusted. However, if he was flattered by a monster, then it would be a different story. What he, Wang Zhan, loved to do the most was to subdue the monstrous geniuses of his generation. Because of the sense of achievement. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly said in a deep voice, "Brother Wang, let this old man go." Wang Zhan frowned slightly. "Why?" Yi Xian glanced at the old man. "This old man is from the minor abode. Brother Wang, if you kill him, then the minor abode will probably put a bounty on your head." Xiao Linlang glanced at the old man's soul when she heard Yi Xian, and then she shook her head. "The old man is gone." Sure enough, Wang Zhan smiled proudly when he heard Yi Xian. "Why would I, Wang Zhan, fear the minor abode?" As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly vanished on the spot. The old man's expression instantly changed drastically, and he was just about to flee when a fist smashed against him. Bang! The old man's soul was instantly obliterated, and even his consciousness was obliterated. He was killed. Some of the others here fell silent when they witnessed this scene. Wang Zhan represented halberd. So, how could the minor abode tolerate him killing someone from the minor abode? Of course not. However, the battle pavilion would never give up on Wang Zhan. Wang Zhan was the future of the battle pavilion. Meanwhile, Wang Zhan waved his right hand, and one of the old man's spatial rings floated into his grasp. There were only some ordinary treasures and divine crystals within it. Wang Zhan turned around to gaze at Yi Xian. "Brother Yi." Yi Xian spoke solemnly, "They've probably moved." Moved? Wang Zhan's face instantly fell when he heard this. Meanwhile, Yi Xian suddenly said, "Brother Wang, the minor abode will definitely take revenge on you." "You?" Wang Zhan smiled proudly, "Let them." Yi Xian smiled bitterly, "Brother Wang, I have to flee. The minor abode will probably not let me go as well. I have to hide. I'll seek guidance from Brother Wang if I have the chance in the future." Wang Zhan hesitated for a moment before he nodded, "All right." Yi Xian cupped his fists, "Brother Wang, we'll meet again." As soon as he finished speaking, he gazed at Xiao Linlang. "Miss Linlang, we'll meet again." Xiao Linlang gazed at Yi Xian. "Young Master Yi, take care of yourself." Yi Xian nodded, and then he transformed into a ray of light that vanished into the horizon. Wang Zhan gazed at Yi Xian who'd vanished into the horizon, and he spoke softly, "Brother Yi isn't a bad person. Why is the Great Spiritual God Palace bad-mouthing him? The Great Spiritual God Palace is really despicable." Xiao Linlang was speechless. P.S. I forgot to ask for votes yesterday. I lost a few thousand monthly votes. Chapter 1791. After leaving the ruins of Sword Sect, Yi Xian went straight to a mountain range. Somewhere by a river, Yi Xian sat on the ground with his legs crossed. In front of him were 3 storage rings. One of the storage rings contained over 100 million eternal divine crystals. There were originally more than 150 million of them. He let Leng Xinxin take more than 50 million eternal divine gems away, and these 50 million eternal divine gems were enough to raise the strength of the entire Sword Alliance by a large level. Especially when Leng Xinxin brought back some cultivation methods and sword skills. They were too useful for the Sword Alliance. It wouldn't be long before the overall strength of the Sword League would reach the level of a super force in the ancient God Star region. Because the Sword Alliance's swordsman's innate gifts were terrifying. Yi Xian collected his thoughts and looked at the second storage ring. With a thought, a sword floated out from the storage ring. The sword was 4 feet long and 3 fingers wide. There was a lightning-like shape on the blade. It was the best sword among all the swords in the ruins of Sword Sect. Yi Xian sized up the sword. At this moment, a voice suddenly sounded from within the sword. Are you the new master? It had a spirit. Yi Xian smiled and said, yes. What's your name? The sword said, my name is Sword Mausoleum. I am the strongest sword in the history of the Mausoleum of Sword Sect. There is no sword more powerful than mine in this world. His voice was filled with pride. Yi Xian blinked. Really? The Sword Mausoleum said proudly, of course. Yi Xian opened his palm, and the green profound sword appeared in his hand. What about this one? The Sword Mausoleum suddenly trembled and said in shock, this. Yi Xian smiled and said, how are you? Wow. Sword Mausoleum started crying, you bullied me. Yi Xian's face darkened. Damn it. Could this sword belong to a child? The sword ruined suddenly said, Master, quickly put it away. I'm afraid. Yi Xian was puzzled. Why are you afraid? Sword Mausoleum said in a trembling voice, aura. That sword has a terrifying aura. Yi Xian was silent. The other party might be talking about Qing'er. This green profound sword was personally forged by Qing'er, so it was normal for it to have her aura. The Mausoleum of Swords was afraid of Qing'er. Yi Xian sheathed the Qingxian sword. He looked at the Mausoleum of Swords and smiled. How about you follow me from now on? This Sword Mausoleum's level should be at peak ancient god realm, just right for him. The Sword Mausoleum hesitated for a moment before he said, can I refuse? Yi Xian laughed. Why? The Sword Ruin said, you don't look like a good person. Yi Xian's face darkened. As a sword, do you still need to differentiate between good and bad masters? The Sword Ruin said, of course. What if I choose someone who doesn't have a conscience and doesn't treat me well? Yi Xian smiled and said, I will treat you well. The Sword Ruin said, then can I make a request? Yi Xian said, tell me about it. The Sword Ruins hurriedly said, I need to be nourished with powerful sword qi and sword intent. Are you willing to nourish me every day? Yi Xian laughed. That's not a problem at all. The Sword Ruin said, then I'll follow you. Yi Xian smiled. Then we're friends from now on. The Sword Ruin said, you're the master. Yi Xian shook his head. We're friends. The Sword Ruins was silent for a moment before he said, is there any difference between friends and masters? Yi Xian was speechless. This chapter is not over, please continue to the next page. He really didn't know how to answer this question. The Sword Ruin said, since there's no difference, then I'll call you master. Yi Xian said with a smile, as you wish. At this moment, Xiao Ta suddenly said, young lord, let it play with me and soul. Yi Xian said in a low voice, Xiao Ta, don't lead them astray. Xiao Ta was a little displeased. Am I that kind of tower? Yi Xian said indifferently, you're not serious. Xiao Ta. Yi Xian didn't talk nonsense with Xiao Ta anymore. He put away the sword ruins and looked at the third storage ring. There was only one sword technique in the third storage ring. Sword kinesis technique. The ruins of sword sect definitely had more than this sword technique. However, even the powerful ruins of sword sect sword techniques were far inferior to the sword drawing technique and life and death with one sword. Therefore, he didn't choose to learn those. However, this sword kinesis technique was very helpful to him. He wanted to create a flying sword technique of his own now. As for the other sword techniques and mental cultivation techniques in the ruins of sword sect, as well as the good swords, he let Ling Xinxin bring all of them back to the Sword Alliance. He couldn't fight alone. He had to nurture the Sword Alliance. A moment later, Yi Xian disappeared on the spot. When he reappeared, he was already in an unknown dead starfield. Cultivate the flying sword technique. Yi Xian opened his palm, and a sword condensed from the power of time and space suddenly appeared in his hand. The next moment, the sword appeared thousands of feet away. Speed. The core of the flying sword was speed. He wanted to cultivate this speed to the extreme. The moment he wanted to kill, the enemy had to die. Just like that, Yi Xian combined the advantages of the sword kinesis technique and kept increasing the speed of his flying sword. There was no limit, only an even higher limit. Small Grotto Heaven. The small Grotto Heaven master sat on a rock beside the bamboo house with his eyes closed. He seemed to have become one with heaven and earth. At that moment, a shadow appeared in front of the old man. The shadow bowed slightly. Grotto Heaven Master, Elder Yu who went to look for Yi Xian was killed by the battle pavilion. Hearing that, the old man frowned slightly. Killed by the battle pavilion? Elder Yu nodded. He was killed by that monster from the battle pavilion, Wang Zhan. As for the reason, that Wang Zhan said that Elder Yu insulted him. A cold glint flashed across the elder's eyes. This battle pavilion is so impressive. How dare you kill the people of my little Grotto Heaven? The virtual figure nodded. They are indeed disrespecting my small cave. However, I still feel that there is something fishy about this matter. However, the old man shook his head. I don't care. Since they killed our people, we naturally have to return the favor. Send someone to kill one of their great sages. The figure hesitated for a moment, and then he said, doing so might cause hostility between us, and it might even lead to war. The old man glanced at the phantom. If they aren't afraid, why should we be? If we don't return the favor, the world will think that we are afraid of the battle pavilion. Kill. The phantom thought for a moment, then said, if the war starts, the old man said indifferently, then let's fight. The small Grotto Heaven was not afraid of the battle pavilion at all. Moreover, the small Grotto Heaven was backed by the supreme laws of the universe. With the supreme laws of the universe, the small Grotto Heaven was not afraid of any forces in this world. The phantom turned around and left. At this moment, the old man suddenly said, what about Yi Xian's whereabouts? The phantom said in a deep voice, he is hiding. The palace master of the Great Spiritual Palace has already made it clear that they have expelled Yi Xian from the Great Spiritual Palace, and they will not interfere in the matters between us and him. The old man was silent. This chapter is not finished, please continue to the next page. After a while, he asked again, is there still no news of the lady in the plain dress? The phantom shook his head. Still no news. The old man said, issue a universal bounty. Anyone who knows where this lady is will be rewarded with 300,000 eternal divine crystals. Since she is severely injured, there will be many extraordinary people who will help us find this lady. The phantom nodded. All right. After that, he turned around and left. The old man lay on the bamboo chair and slowly closed his eyes. Those who offend my small cave will be killed no matter how far they are. The Battle Pavilion. The Battle Pavilion was located on a lonely mountain in the north of the ancient god galaxy. On this day, a corpse suddenly fell from the sky above the Battle Pavilion. In front of a palace, a middle-aged man looked at the corpse and said, "The small cave has made a move." This man was the current pavilion master of the battle pavilion, Zhu Shao. An elder of the battle pavilion spoke in a low voice, "The tiny abode is declaring war against us." Zhu Shao was expressionless. "Where is Wang Zhan?" At this moment, Wang Zhan suddenly appeared. He glanced at the corpse on the ground and his face darkened. The small cave did this. Zhu Shao looked at Wang Zhan. "Why did you kill him?" "I am not blaming you, but I feel that there is something fishy about this." After a moment of silence, Wang Zhan said, "This man insulted me, so I attacked him. As for killing him, he was too arrogant and I couldn't control myself." Couldn't control himself. Everyone was speechless. This was the small cave. No matter what, they should have left some leeway. Of course, they did not blame Wang Zhan. What a joke. He was the future of the battle pavilion. Meanwhile, a middle-aged man in a white robe suddenly said, "Pavilion master, if we fight back, then it's equivalent to declaring war. If we don't fight back, then our battle pavilion will be humiliated." Zhu Shao looked at the middle-aged man in a white robe. "Elderly, what do you think?" Elderly shook his head. "It's not worth it to start a war like this. It's even more meaningless. Because once we start a war, it won't just be one or two of us who will die. But if we don't start a war, the world will think that the battle pavilion is afraid of the small cave." As he spoke, he smiled. "I have an idea. Let Wang Zhan fight the geniuses of the small cave's younger generation and have a life and death battle." A life and death battle. As soon as he said this, everyone nodded their heads. That's a good idea. But if Wang Zhan can't defeat them, everyone looked at Wang Zhan. Wang Zhan laughed. Wang Zhan, am not afraid of anyone in the younger generation." Meanwhile, Elderly shook his head. "Little fellow, I know you are a genius, but don't underestimate the geniuses of the world. Putting everything else aside, Li Yaoya, Xiao Linlang, and that guy from Sky Demon Nation are not any weaker than you. And that Yi Xian who just appeared, this person is not simple." Wang Zhan suddenly laughed. "Yi Xian?" Elderly nodded. "You know him?" Wang Zhan smiled and said, "I met him before. This person's character is not bad, but his strength is a little weak. He even said that he would come to me for guidance in the future." Elderly frowned. "He said that?" Wang Zhan nodded. "This person is not bad." He didn't know why the great spiritual god Palace kept badmouthing him. How unethical. After a moment of silence, Elderly said, "In short, don't look down on anyone, understand?" Wang Zhan nodded. "I understand." Zhu Shao suddenly said, "Fighting against the monstrous geniuses and geniuses of the small caves, not only does it concern the reputation of the battle pavilion, it also concerns your life and death. Are you confident?" Wang Zhan laughed. "Yes." Zhu Shao nodded. "Send the letter of challenge to the little paradise." A letter of challenge. End of chapter. Chapter 1792. A dual invitation. Soon, a dual invitation was sent to the small cave. The news spread across the entire ancient God Star area and the small caves like a plague. The battle pavilion's action was equivalent to a public challenge to the small cave. The small cave would definitely accept it. Because it was related to the small cave's reputation. How embarrassing it would be if it didn't accept it. Soon, the small cave replied. Accept the dual invitation. The two sides agreed to have a duel in the ancient star field 3 days later. It would be a battle of life and death. This duel had undoubtedly attracted the attention of countless people. Some people rushed to the ancient star field. At this moment, Yi Xian was still cultivating. In the dead silent starry sky, countless flying swords were flying around. They were all spacetime swords created by Yi Xian. At this time, Yi Xian suddenly opened his palm. In an instant, all the space-time swords flew back to his palm. In the surrounding starry sky, there were many residual shadows of the flying swords. Their speed was simply too fast. Now, the speed of his flying swords was so fast that even he was a bit afraid of them. Especially if they were used for a sneak attack, even he would find it difficult to resist them, let alone others. His flying sword art could be considered to have reached the initial level. In terms of power, the current flying sword art was not as terrifying as drawing the sword to decide life and death. However, in terms of speed, it was much faster. It could be said that even a great sage would find it difficult to resist his flying sword art. Yi Xian put away the space-time swords and looked around. The residual shadows of the flying swords were still around. Yi Xian laughed and waved his right hand. The residual shadows of the flying swords instantly disappeared. At this time, the space in front of Yi Xian suddenly trembled. Soon, Dao Yi's voice was heard in front of him. Are you going to the ancient star field? Ancient star field. Yi Xian took out the Qingxian sword. With a thought, he appeared right in front of the Taoist side of Lingxiu Peak. Seeing Yi Xian's sudden appearance, Dao Yi was stunned. You. Yi Xian smiled. You mentioned the ancient star field just now. What's going on? Dao Yi said, don't you know? The battle pavilion has issued a dual invitation to the small cave. Send a letter of challenge. Yi Xian was taken aback. Challenge? Dao Yi nodded. Yes. Yi Xian was silent. He didn't expect that the battle pavilion and the small heavenly abode would start a war. Dao Yi continued, but it won't be an all-out war. The battle pavilion had sent out Wang Zhan. Both sides had sent out the younger generation. The kind that decides life and death. Yi Xian asked in a deep voice, who did the small grotto heaven send? Dao Yi shook his head. I don't know yet. As she spoke, she paused for a moment before she continued, no matter what the final outcome of this battle is, both sides will probably become mortal enemies. Yi Xian nodded. The battle pavilion had sent out Wang Zhan. He was the future of the battle pavilion, and the little cave world would definitely not send an ordinary person. No matter which one of them died, the other would not accept it. Therefore, both sides had completely turned against each other. Dao Yi said, let's go. Yi Xian nodded. As both of them were about to leave, a man appeared at the entrance of the courtyard. When the man saw Yi Xian, he was stunned. Who are you? Yi Xian frowned. Who are you? The man stared at Yi Xian. I am an inner disciple, Guyun. Inner disciple. Yi Xian looked at Guyun. What's the matter? Guyun took a glance at Dao Yi and narrowed his eyes. What's the relationship between you and Miss Dao Yi? Yi Xian held Dao Yi's hand and smiled. What's the relationship between us? Dao Yi took a glance at Yi Xian and said nothing. On the other hand, Guyun flew into a rage. How dare you? How can an outer disciple like you be worthy of Miss Dao Yi? You. This chapter is not finished. Please continue to the next page. At this time. Brother Yi, why are you here? Yi Xian turned his head. Not far away, Li Xiuran was walking quickly towards him. Li Xiuran was obviously happy to see Yi Xian. He quickly walked towards Yi Xian and smiled. Brother Yi, long time no see. Yi Xian smiled. Brotherly, you seem to have become stronger. Li Xiuran was about to speak when Guyun suddenly said in a trembling voice. Yi, you are Yi Xian. Yi Xian looked at Guyun and smiled. I am Yi Xian. Do you have a problem? Guyun's face turned pale. Yi Xian looked at Guyun. Dao Yi is my woman. Do you understand? Guyun hurriedly said. Yes. I understand. I will never appear in front of Miss Dao Yi again. Yi Xian smiled. It's not that serious. Just don't harass her. Guyan trembled. Yes, yes. Then he turned and ran. Yi Xian. Who doesn't know Yi Xian's name? This is a person who dares to kill a true disciple. He actually knows about Yi Xian. But he has never seen Yi Xian. He didn't expect Yi Xian to come again. Wasn't he expelled from Great Spiritual God Palace? In the courtyard, Yi Xian looked at Li Xiuran. Brotherly, have you entered the inner sect? Li Xiuran laughed. I don't want to enter the inner sect anymore. Yi Xian was puzzled. Why? Li Xiuran smiled. Outer sect disciples are treated very well now. Moreover, the inner sect is still ostracizing us. So, it's fine if we don't go. Yi Xian said. Is it because of me? Li Xiuran smiled. Actually, we still have to thank you. If it wasn't for you, the palace wouldn't even care about the outer sect. The treatment of outer sect disciples is no worse than that of inner sect disciples. Yi Xian smiled. It's good that I didn't cause you any trouble. Li Xiuran smiled. Brother Yi, are you and Miss Dao Yi going to Ancient Star Sector? Yi Xian nodded. You're going too? Li Xiuran laughed. Such a big event, of course I have to go. Yi Xian smiled. Then let's go together. After saying that, the three of them disappeared. In space, Yi Xian flew on his sword. Beside him were Dao Yi and Li Xiuran. Although his Azure Profound Sword can teleport across Star Sector, he needs to know the exact location of Ancient Star Sector. Otherwise, he can't teleport. At this time, Dao Yi suddenly turned to look at Yi Xian. Am I your woman? Yi Xian blinked. I'm afraid that he will harass you frequently. Dao Yi stared at Yi Xian. Is that so? Yi Xian said seriously. Of course. You know that I'm a very pure person. Dao Yi shook her head. You told me that the world is too bitter. Now it seems that it's complete nonsense. I think that you should suffer a little more. Yi Xian, Dao Yi said. The speed at which your strength grows is too terrifying. In the past, she could suppress Yi Xian. But now, Yi Xian can suppress her. And how long has it been? This guy's cultivation speed is too ridiculous. Yi Xian smiled. I've never forgotten those days. How hard was it for him? Fuck. I feel like crying when I think about it. His enemies were always abnormal, and they were always several levels higher than him. How can I win? I can't win at all. At that time, it's not that I'm too weak. It's that my enemies are too strong. Dao Yi looked at Yi Xian. What do you plan to do next? Plan. Yi Xian smiled. Become stronger. If this chapter is not finished, please continue to the next page, Dao Yi asked again. How strong? Yi Xian was silent for a moment. Then, he smiled. Stronger than Qing and Dad. Dao Yi looked at Yi Xian. Are you serious? Yi Xian smiled. I've never been so serious. He knew that if he doesn't become stronger than Qing and Dad, he can't stop them from competing. Dao Yi said softly, do your best. Yi Xian smiled. I will. Half an hour later, the three of them arrived at Ancient Star Sector. Ancient Star Sector is an abandoned star sector. However, this place is not completely dead. There is life in this star sector. However, only some rogue cultivators live here. Ancient City. When the three of them arrived in front of the ancient city, Yi Xian looked at the ancient city. It is very old and dilapidated. However, from the size of the city, it must have been glorious in the past. Li Xiuran suddenly said. There are many people here. Yi Xian looked inside the city. Indeed, there are many people here. The three of them were about to enter when a figure suddenly fell from the sky. Bang! That figure fell directly in front of Yi Xian's group. Yi Xian looked at the person in the pit. When he saw that person, he was stunned. He knows the person in the pit. It's that old Li who tried to fool him when he first arrived at Ancient God Star Sector. At this time, a young man suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian's group. The young man glanced at Yi Xian's group and did not speak. Inside the pit, old Li climbed up. When he saw Yi Xian, old Li was stunned. Then he said, "Young Master Yi." Yi Xian looked at old Li. "Didn't I tell you to stop?" Old Li smiled bitterly. "Cultivation requires resources." "I sigh." Yi Xian shook his head and sighed. "You deserve it." Old Li's smile became more bitter. "If I can't improve further, I will become older and older. I've made a fool of myself in front of young Master Yi." Yi Xian thought for a moment. Then he turned to look at the young man beside him. "Brother, how should I address you?" The young man looked at Yi Xian. "You want to save him?" Yi Xian was about to speak. Then he thought of something and shook his head. "No." Then he looked at Dao Yi and Li Shuran. "Let's go." Dao Yi glanced at it and nodded. The three of them walked into the city. At the side, old Li's face turned pale. "Young Master Yi." Yi Xian stopped and looked at old Li. "Old Li, if you're just fooling people to earn some money, I will save them. But you're not. Not only are you fooling people, but you also want to kill them. All these years, many people have died in your hands, right?" Old Li quickly said. "I will turn over a new leaf." Yi Xian shook his head. "I didn't kill you back then because I wanted to give you a chance to turn over a new leaf. But you didn't listen. If I save an evil person, many innocent people will die in the future." Then he pulled Dao Yi and walked into the city. Old Li's face was ashen. He collapsed on the ground. When he saw Yi Xian, he saw hope from despair. Now, that hope turned into despair. The young man looked at Old Li and waved his hand. Boom! Old Li was wiped out. In the distant city, Yi Xian suddenly stopped. In his body, the green profound sword trembled slightly. His sword truth aura was released uncontrollably. Sword truth transformation. Yi Xian was stunned. P.S. The weather is getting colder. Everyone, please keep warm. It's too cold. Especially those with children. Many children around me have caught a cold. Everyone, please be careful. End of this chapter. Chapter 1793. Heart. A swordsman cultivates the heart, and this heart is not easy to cultivate. Follow one's heart? He, Yi Xian, has always followed his heart. If following one's heart is wrong, why should he follow it? He did want to save Old Li from the start. Because he felt that he knew Old Li, so he wanted to save him. But on second thought, what did Old Li do? He killed him and robbed him. If he saved this kind of person, then in the future, more innocent people will die. He must follow one's heart, but he must also subdue it. Because most of the time, one's heart is evil. One can be confident, but not egotistical. At the city gate, Yi Xian's sword aura was getting stronger, and the reaction of the green profound sword in his body was also getting stronger. It was not only the transformation of the sword. It was also the transformation of the heart. At this time, Yi Xian opened his eyes, he opened his palm, and the sword aura on his body flowed back into his palm. Next to Yi Xian, Dao Yi said softly, "Breakthrough?" Yi Xian nodded, "Breakthrough in the sword." Breakthrough in the sword. He did not know what level he was at now, but he knew that he was much stronger than a few breaths ago. At this time, Xiao Ta suddenly said, "Young master, you are now a real swordsman." Yi Xian smiled, "A real swordsman?" Xiao Ta said, "Master once said that it is not difficult to follow one's heart, but to subdue it. It is not difficult for a swordsman to do as he pleases, but it is difficult to restrain oneself. Humans are humans because they can restrain themselves, and have a set of standards in their heart. Good is good, evil is evil. Yi Xian suddenly said, "That's not right." Xiao Ta asked, "What's not right?" Yi Xian said in a deep voice, "Qing seems to do whatever she wants." Xiao Ta was silent for a moment, then said, "Young master, can you not compare yourself to her? Is it hard to have an idea?" Yi Xian was speechless. Xiao Ta continued, "Young master's current sword Dao realm should be at the descent realm." Yi Xian frowned. "Lower your realm?" Xiao Ta nodded, "Yes. Listen to the inner heart, know the inner heart, and descend to the inner heart." The young lord is now in a subduing state. If we're talking about ordinary realms, the current you is equivalent to a great saint. Yi Xian said in a deep voice, "In other words, I can be considered a great sage now." Xiao Ta said, "You can say that. Moreover, after subduing his heart, the power of the young master's sword techniques will be much stronger. Your sword drawing to decide life and death and flying sword technique will be much stronger than before." Yi Xian nodded. "I know. The power of his sword draw to determine life and death was at least 40% stronger than before, and so was the speed of his flying sword." Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. Most of the time, enlightenment was better than bitter cultivation. He did not expect that his previous action would directly cause his state of mind to break through. However, this also made him understand that following his heart did not mean that he could act recklessly. Subduing his heart. As if thinking of something, Yi Xian suddenly asked, "Xiao Ta, do you know what's above the descent realm?" Xiao Ta said, "I don't know." Yi Xian blinked. "You don't know?" Xiao Ta was a little helpless. "Young master, I'm just a tower." Yi Xian's mouth twitched. "Damn, now you know that you're a tower." At this time, Dao Yi suddenly said, "Let's go in." Yi Xian collected his thoughts and nodded. Along the way, Yi Xian and the other two kept looking around. It had to be said that the city was really dilapidated. There were ruins everywhere, and the smell of decay was also emitting. This city must have been ravaged by something in the past for it to be in its current state. At the end of prosperity was decline. At this time, Li Xiuran suddenly said, "According to the ancient records, this ancient star sector was once very prosperous, even more prosperous than ancient god sector. However, for some reason, it declined later." Yi Xian nodded slightly. He could see that this city must have been very prosperous in the past. Li Xiuran said again, "Now, this place has become a slum." Yi Xian frowned. "Slum?" Li Xiuran nodded. "Although the spiritual qi in this place is not completely exhausted, the spiritual qi in this place is no longer suitable for cultivation. Some of the people here have very low cultivation realms, and their lifespans are not particularly long. Because the spiritual qi here is slowly drying up, the air here has been polluted." Yi Xian sensed his surroundings. Indeed, not only was the spiritual qi here pitifully small, the air was also mixed with some bad substances. As if thinking of something, Yi Xian suddenly asked, "This place is not a dead star sector. They arranged Biwuan here, will it affect this place?" Li Xiuran shook his head. "No one will care about this." Yi Xian was silent. At this moment, a little girl carrying a backpack suddenly ran in front of the three of them. The little girl wore a floral shirt and cotton pants. The shirt and pants were full of patches. Moreover, it was obviously not in line with the little girl's figure. The shirt and pants were too small, which looked very incongruous. The little girl had two small braids. Her petite face was full of mud, and only a pair of quick-witted eyes could be seen. On the little girl's feet, she wore a pair of grass shoes weaved from vines. They were also very small, and the little girl's thumbs were already above the toes of the shoes. As she ran, the little girl's thumbs were bent. Because if she was not careful, her thumbs would come into intimate contact with the ground. The little girl looked at Yi Xian and the other two and bowed respectfully. 3 immortals, are you here to watch the competition? Yi Xian said with a smile, yeah. The little girl hurriedly said, the competition will only start 2 days later. During this time, you need a place to stay. Do you want to go to my house? Even though it's small, it's very clean. 1 low-grade spirit stone is enough. Yi Xian glanced at the little girl's backpack. There were some medicinal herbs in the backpack. The little girl continued, 3 immortals, my home isn't just clean, it's very quiet as well. No one will disturb you. Yi Xian smiled and said, only 1 low-grade spirit stone? The little girl hurriedly nodded. Yi Xian smiled. All right. Then let's go to your home. The little girl was overjoyed when she heard this. She hurriedly said, 3 immortals, please come with me. She turned around and walked away. Yi Xian smiled, and then he followed her with Dao Yi and Li Xiran. It didn't take long for the 3 of them to arrive at a small courtyard. Needless to say, the courtyard was really small. There were only 3 small rooms, and it was extremely run down. But it was really very clean. After entering the courtyard, the little girl pointed at a small courtyard on the side, 3 immortals, you can stay here. If you need anything, just let me know. My name is Shaoan, and I'll be at your service at any time. Yi Xian smiled. All right. Shaoan bowed slightly. I won't disturb you anymore. Then she turned around and walked towards a small room on the right. Meanwhile, Li Xiran suddenly said, Brother Yi, Miss Dao Yi, both of you rest here. I'll go ask around in the city. I'm afraid there are quite a lot of people coming this time, so I need to understand the situation first. Yi Xian said with a smile, great. Li Xiran turned around and left. Dao Yi suddenly said, who do you think will win, Wang Zhan or the genius from the small grotto heaven? Yi Xian shook his head. It's hard to say. Since the small grotto heaven dared to accept the challenge, they definitely won't send an ordinary genius. Dao Yi nodded. That's true. Just as Yi Xian was about to speak, an angry roar came from the small room next door. Shaoan. Where the hell have you been? Hearing this, Yi Xian frowned. He walked slowly to the small room on the other side. A man was lying in the room. The man's face was pale and he looked very weak. Shaoan was cooking by the side. Seeing Yi Xian and Yi Xian, Shaoan quickly ran to them and said with a trembling voice, Did I disturb you immortals? Yi Xian smiled. No. Then he looked at the young man on the bed. Who is he? Shaoan said softly, He's my brother. Yi Xian looked at the young man. He looks very weak. Shaoan lowered his head. My brother smokes. Smokes. Yi Xian frowned. Of course, he knew what smokes were. That was something harmful, especially to ordinary people. It was a slow poison. Suddenly, the young man shouted angrily. Haven't you cooked anything good? Do you want to die? Hearing this, Yi Xian and Dao Yi frowned. Shaoan said quickly, It's almost ready. Then she ran to the stove and started cooking. Soon, she brought a bowl of porridge to the young man. Brother, be careful. It's hot. The young man looked at the bowl of porridge and his face changed. He knocked the bowl of porridge down and shouted angrily. You want me to drink this? Where's the meat? Where's the meat? Shaoan said softly, I didn't sell any herbs today, trash. The young man suddenly shouted angrily. You're a trash. Stupid trash. Shaoan lowered his head. Brother, the young man looked at Shaoan angrily. Why aren't you selling the herbs? Scram. Shaoan lowered his head and tears flowed down uncontrollably. The young man continued to shout. Cry. You only know how to cry. You're a trash. Wait till I recover. I'll sell you. At this moment, Dao Yi suddenly walked to Xiao An's side. She gently rubbed Xiao An's little head. Don't cry. Xiao An's body trembled slightly. Sorry. Immortal, I'm disturbing you. Dao Yi smiled. No. Then, she pulled Xiao An's hand and said, I'll bring you to buy some meat. Xiao An shook his head. I don't have money, Dao Yi smiled. I do. With that, she pulled Xiao An out. Yi Xian took a look at the man lying on the bed and followed him out. Outside. Yi Xian smiled. Xiao An, your brother treats you like this. Why do you still take care of him? Xiao An was silent for a long time. He's the only family I have. Yi Xian and Dao Yi were silent. Inside the house. The young man was still shouting madly. Useless bitch, trash. Chapter 1794. Yi Xian looked at the young man who was still roaring in the room and his eyes gradually turned cold. The young man was beyond cure and his body was rotten. If not for Xiao An's care, he would have been dead. At this time, Xiao An wanted to say something but stopped. Dao Yi smiled and said, You want us to save your brother? Xiao An lowered her head slightly and said, I don't dare. Dao Yi turned to look at Yi Xian and Yi Xian smiled and said, Even if you save him, he will not treat you well. Xiao An turned to look at the room and said softly, But I still want him alive. Yi Xian said, We can save him. Xiao An suddenly looked at Yi Xian and knelt in front of Yi Xian and said with a trembling voice, Immortal. Yi Xian helped Xiao An up and said with a smile, But I have a condition. Xiao An quickly said, I will agree to anything. I will agree to anything. Yi Xian looked at Xiao An and said, We can save him but you have to come with us. Hearing this, Xiao An was stunned and said, I go with you? Yi Xian nodded and said, Yes. Xiao An clenched her fists and her eyes were full of disbelief and said, Immortal, you want to take me away? Yi Xian nodded and said with a smile, Yes. Xiao An said with a trembling voice, But I don't have any talent. She was in disbelief because sometimes some immortals would come to this place and those immortals would take away some people. However, they were all people with great talent. As long as they were taken away, it was equivalent to changing their fate. But she had never dared to think like this. Yi Xian gently patted Xiao An's head and said, You don't need any talent. Just come with me and I will arrange a good home for you. Xiao An quickly knelt and kowtowed and said, Thank you, immortal, thank you. Yi Xian helped him up again. But we won't take your brother away. Xiao An glanced at Yi Xian and said in a low voice, Immortal, please spare his life. Hearing this, Yi Xian was slightly stunned. He gently patted Xiao An's little head and shook his head with a smile. Smart girl. This little girl had already seen through his murderous intent towards the young man. Not simple at all. Yi Xian turned around and walked into the house. Xiao An wanted to follow him, but she hesitated and decided not to. She didn't beg Yi Xian and Dao Yi to take her brother away because she knew that she wasn't qualified to do so. Before long, Yi Xian walked out. Looking at Yi Xian, and was a little nervous. Yi Xian smiled and said, He has recovered. Xiao An immediately wanted to kneel down but was stopped by Yi Xian. Yi Xian looked at Xiao An and said, You don't have to kneel in front of us in the future. This sister beside you is Dao Yi. I am Yi Xian. You can call her sister Dao Yi and call me brother Yi Xian. Understand? Xiao An hesitated and nodded. Okay. Brother Yi Xian. Yi Xian smiled and said, Let's go. Xiao An blinked. Are we leaving now? Yi Xian smiled and said, Are you saying goodbye to your brother? Xiao An was silent for a moment. She looked into the house and said softly, Brother, I can't take care of you anymore. Take care of yourself. After that, she turned around and held Yi Xian's hand. However, she instinctively pulled her hand back. Yi Xian held Xiao An's hand and smiled. Let's go. After that, he pulled Xiao An and walked into the distance. At this time, he suddenly frowned and opened Xiao An's palm. There was a black lotus mark on Xiao An's palm. Yi Xian looked at the black lotus mark and said softly, "What is this?" Xiao An shook her head. "I don't know. They said it was a birthmark." Yi Xian gently touched the black lotus mark. At this time, something strange happened. Yi Xian's finger suddenly started burning. The next moment, the flame spread to his whole body. Boom! Yi Xian turned into a man of fire. At this moment, the power of bloodline in Yi Xian's body suddenly erupted. Rumble! Yi Xian's power of bloodline forced the flame out of his body and the flame returned to Xiao An's palm. At this moment, cold sweat slowly dripped from Yi Xian's forehead. At that moment, he was almost burned to ashes. If it wasn't for his power of bloodline, he would have been dead. Even his consciousness would have been erased. At this time, Xiao An's face turned abnormally pale. She said in fear, "Brother Yi Xian." Yi Xian smiled. "I'm fine." After that, he looked at the black mark on Xiao An's palm. Damn it. This Xiao An is not an ordinary person. At the side, Dao Yi suddenly shook his head. "You're simply a pervert." Yi Xian looked at Dao Yi. "What do you mean?" Dao Yi looked at him and said, "I realize that your sister is not an ordinary person. Even if she's just an adopted sister." Yi Xian, at this moment, he was really speechless. This Xiao An is definitely not an ordinary person. But is it really so coincidental? I just randomly adopted a sister, and this sister is not an ordinary person. Should I go and adopt a few more sisters? At this time, Dao Yi suddenly squatted down and held Xiao An's hand. At this moment, the black lotus mark had returned to normal and there was no aura. Xiao An said in a low voice. "This is not simple." Yi Xian nodded. With his current strength, it was difficult for anything to hurt him. But just now, this thing almost killed him. This is too perverse. Even now, he still has some lingering fear. Dao Yi said in a low voice. "What do you plan to do now?" Yi Xian smiled. "What else can I do? Of course, I will bring her along. When I have the chance to meet Qing'er, I will ask Qing'er to help me." Xiao An's background is definitely not simple. Dao Yi thought for a while and nodded. "That's the only way." At this time, Xiao An suddenly said in a low voice. "Brother Yi Xian. Are you still willing to have me?" Yi Xian laughed. "Of course. Who knows, you might be able to protect me in the future." Xiao An blinked. He didn't quite understand. Yi Xian said with a smile, "Let's go." As he spoke, he walked to the other side of Xiao An and held Xiao An's left hand. He didn't dare to hold Xiao An's right hand anymore. He was still a little afraid of the flame. The group left the courtyard. Along the way, Xiao An kept introducing the ancient Star City to Yi Xian and Yi Xian. There were also some forces in the ancient Star City. One of them was called the Gate of Heaven, which was the strongest force in the ancient star system. In Xiao An's words, there were many people in the Gate of Heaven who could fly. However, when the battle pavilion and the small grotto heaven arranged the arena here, these forces quickly moved out. Obviously, they were afraid of being affected by the battle. After all, once such experts entered into battle, then if they didn't have the protection of a formidable sect, then the entire ancient star city would probably be destroyed in an instant. The ordinary people in the city obviously didn't know about this. For example, Xiao An. Until now, she still didn't know what the competition meant. Right at this moment, Li Shuran suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian and the others. Yi Xian said with a smile, did you find out who the small grotto heaven sent this time? Li Shiran shook his head, no. It's very mysterious. Yi Xian frowned slightly. Are there any monstrous geniuses in the small grotto heaven? The very famous ones. Li Shiran said in a deep voice, there are a few, but they are much weaker than Wang Zhan. I'm afraid this matter isn't that simple. Yi Xian said, what about the battle pavilion? Are they here? Li Shiran nodded, they are. They are now in the north. Yi Xian asked again, what about the small grotto heaven? Li Shiran said in a deep voice, they are here too. In the south. But we can't get close. Yi Xian looked towards the south and said with a smile, it seems that the people the small grotto heaven sent to fight Wang Zhan are not simple. Li Shiran nodded, the battle pavilion is in a bad situation now because the small grotto heaven knows that they are sending Wang Zhan, but they don't know who they are sending. Yi Xian suddenly asked, how many people are coming from the small grotto heaven this time? Li Shiran said, about a dozen. There are 3 great sages among them. 3 great sages. Yi Xian smiled, and a murderous intent flashed in the depths of his eyes. Ha! Right at this moment, roaring laughter suddenly resounded in the sky. The crowd looked towards the source of the laughter and saw a man standing in the sky. His body was emitting a terrifying aura. Wang Zhan. Wang Zhan looked towards the south and said with a smile, small grotto heaven, I'm getting impatient. Why don't we fight today? Li Shiran, who was standing next to Yi Xian, said with a smile, this Wang Zhan is really hot-tempered. Yi Xian turned towards the south and said, will the small grotto heaven accept the challenge? Li Shiran said in a deep voice, after being challenged like this, I believe they will accept the challenge. Right at this moment, an old man suddenly appeared in front of Wang Zhan. The old man glanced at Wang Zhan and said calmly, we've agreed to fight tomorrow, so let's do it tomorrow. Why are you in such a hurry? Wang Zhan laughed, I'm just thinking that since we're already here, why wait until tomorrow? Let's fight to the death now. The old man looked at Wang Zhan and said, sure. As he spoke, he turned around and saw a man walking out from not far away. The man wore a simple gray robe, his hair was tied behind his head, and he held a sheathed saber in his hand. Yi Xian turned to look at Li Shiran, who was standing next to him. Li Shiran shook his head, I've never seen him before. Yi Xian frowned slightly as he looked at the man. He couldn't sense the man's aura. It's strange. Dao Yi said softly, he's not simple. Yi Xian nodded. He could sense Wang Zhan's aura, but he couldn't sense the man's. Right at this moment, the saint of the small grotto heaven suddenly said, let my small grotto heaven deal with one thing first. As he spoke, he looked at Yi Xian below, my small grotto heaven wants to kill this person first. Right at this moment, Yi Xian flicked his thumb lightly. Pust. The old man's head was sent flying. Everyone present was dumbfounded. Yi Xian looked around and said, kill me? As he spoke, he shook his head slightly, let your small grotto heaven's old ancestor do it. Call your old ancestor. Everyone was speechless. P.S. Thank you to the alliance leader of One French Fry Friend for tipping. I'm really ashamed that I only saw it now. There are also many readers who tipped and voted for me. Thank you for your support. To be honest, although my updates are stable, there aren't many. I'll reflect on myself. Thank you all for your support. I'll read it every day. I really want to thank all the readers who silently supported me. Some of the readers only voted for me and didn't even post anything. Some of them didn't even speak. Thank you all for your support. Chapter 1795. Instant annihilation. Everyone in the surroundings was stunned. That old man was a saint. Even though he was only a minor saint, he was still a saint. He was instantly annihilated just like that. Most importantly, many of them hadn't even seen how the old man had died. His sword was too swift. The man from the minor abode turned around to look at Yi Xian, and no one knew what he was thinking. Wang Zhan glanced at Yi Xian as well, and he was slightly shocked in his heart. That attack from Yi Xian just now was truly swift, and it was swift to the point of posing a threat to him. He wasn't simple at all. Yi Xian raised his head to look at Wang Zhan, and then he grinned, "Brother Wang, we meet again." Wang Zhan smiled, "Brother Ye's sword is so swift." Yi Xian shook his head and smiled, "It isn't that my sword is swift, but the saints of the minor abode are truly too weak." The expressions of the experts from the minor abode instantly became unsightly when they heard this. That's an insult to the minor abode. A middle-aged man from the shadows spoke softly, "This kid is even stronger than before." It was the palace master of Great Spiritual God Palace, Lin Jiang. The hall master of the enforcement hall, Yan Shi, was by his side. There was a trace of fear in Yan Shi's eyes as he gazed at Yi Xian. "He's much stronger." That attack from Yi Xian just now was so swift that even he felt quite fearful. Lin Jiang suddenly said, "The enmity between him and the minor abode is growing bigger and bigger." Yan Shi said, "But he doesn't care at all. Looks like his background isn't simple at all." Lin Jiang spoke indifferently, "Let's wait and see." Right at this moment, a white-haired old man suddenly appeared not too far away from Yi Xian. As soon as the old man appeared, the space in the surroundings trembled slightly, and then it started to become more and more ethereal. A great saint. The white-haired old man gazed at Yi Xian. "Yi Xian, do you think the people behind you can protect you?" Yi Xian smiled, "Aren't the two of you going to have a battle today? Why don't you fight first? We'll settle our problems after the competition." Meanwhile, Wang Zhan suddenly smiled and said, "Brother Yi is right." As he spoke, he looked at the white-haired old man. "Geezer, let's fight first." The white-haired old man was expressionless. "Since you want to die so much, I'll fulfill your wish." As he spoke, he looked at the young man at the side. "Situ, kill him." The young man slowly walked towards Wang Zhan and slowly placed his left hand on the hilt of his saber. In the distance, Wang Zhan heard Zhu Zhao's voice in his mind, "Don't be careless." Wang Zhan laughed. "Come." As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly leaped up and smashed his fist down towards the young man. Rumble. This punch was like a thunderclap, and the entire ancient star city started to collapse. Countless people in the city were shocked. Beside Yi Xian, Xiao An's face instantly turned pale. She hurriedly turned her head to the right. Yi Xian rubbed her little head lightly. "Your big brother will be fine." Xiaoan held tightly onto Yi Xian's hand with her left hand and spoke with a trembling voice, "Big brother Yi Xian. He's so terrifying." Yi Xian looked up into the sky. Wang Zhan's punch had exceeded the scope of their understanding. On the other hand, the man called Situ's expression was extraordinarily calm when facing Wang Zhan's punch. When Wang Zhan's punch arrived before him, he suddenly took a step forward, drew his saber, and slashed. His saber was swift like a bolt of lightning. Bang! As a wave of saber light erupted, Wang Zhan instantly retreated explosively by 3 kilometers. Seeing this, Yi Xian, who was below, frowned. Situ's saber Dao had attained the descent realm. Moreover, Situ was a great saint. Right at this moment, the battle pavilion's master, Zhu Shao, appeared in the sky. As soon as Zhu Shao appeared, the white-haired old man from the small abode appeared as well. Zhu Shao stared fixedly at Situ with a gloomy expression. The white-haired old man spoke indifferently, "What? We've only exchanged a single blow, yet your battle pavilion can't help but bully the weak?" Zhu Shao gazed at the white-haired old man and was about to speak when Wang Zhan spoke abruptly, "Pavilion master, I'm fine." Zhu Shao spoke solemnly, "He's not simple." Wang Zhan smiled, "So what? I, Wang Zhan, fear no one in the younger generation." As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly vanished on the spot. Bang! An afterimage shot straight at Situ. In an instant, the space before Situ was set ablaze. Meanwhile, Situ slowly closed his eyes, and he suddenly drew his saber when Wang Zhan appeared around 3 m away from him. Hiss! A wave of saber light erupted. Bang! Wang Zhan retreated another few kilometers. He was suppressed. Zhu Zhao's face fell when he witnessed this scene. Wang Zhan had been suppressed twice in a row. At this moment, he felt slightly regretful. If Wang Zhan died, then it would be a huge loss to the battle pavilion. The white-haired old man from the small abode suddenly laughed coldly and ridiculed. What? Pavilion Master Zhu doesn't have confidence in your own genius? Zhu Zhao's expression was terrifyingly gloomy. Suddenly, Wang Zhan laughed ferociously. It's not over yet. As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly soared into the sky, and a powerful force swept out from within him. The force was like a tsunami as it smashed down towards Situ as if it intended to tear him apart. Situ's expression was still calm. When Wang Zhan's force arrived a few meters away from him, a powerful force suddenly surged out from within him. Hiss! Everyone watched as the force slashed through Wang Zhan's force, and it smashed straight towards Wang Zhan with irresistible force. A wisp of ferocity flashed through Wang Zhan's eyes, and then he suddenly smashed his fist forward. Rumble. The force was instantly shattered. Meanwhile, a ray of saber light flashed. Hiss. The spectators didn't even have the chance to react before Situ had appeared behind Wang Zhan, and he slowly sheathed his saber. Behind him, there was a deep saber wound on Wang Zhan's chest. He'd lost. The surroundings suddenly fell silent when they witnessed this scene. In just 3 rounds, Wang Zhan was defeated. Who exactly is this fellow? Everyone in the surroundings was looking at Situ Yen with eyes filled with curiosity. Right at this moment, the white-haired old man suddenly said, Situ, kill him. At this moment, Wang Zhan had lost, but he wasn't dead. Situ immediately turned around and drew his saber when he heard the white-haired old man. Zhu Xiao couldn't be bothered about anything else and was about to attack. However, the white-haired old man suddenly laughed coldly. You want to save him? You're dreaming. As soon as he finished speaking, he vanished on the spot. Bang! Zhu Xiao was forcefully stopped. At this moment, Situ had appeared behind Wang Zhan, so how could Wang Zhan resist Situ? Situ's eyes suddenly narrowed slightly at the critical moment, and then he swiftly turned around and slashed. Bang! An expanse of saber energy shattered while Situ retreated 300 m. After Situ stopped moving, he gazed at Yi Xian. It was Yi Xian who'd attacked just now. Yi Xian walked over to Wang Zhan, and then he glanced at Wang Zhan. How do you feel? Wang Zhan was slightly dazed. I lost. Yi Xian patted Wang Zhan on the shoulder. Victory and defeat are common. There's no need to mind it. Wang Zhan fell silent. Yi Xian gazed at Wang Zhan. Are you a sore loser? Wang Zhan immediately replied, I, Wang Zhan, am naturally a sore loser. Yi Xian smiled. It's good that you're a sore loser. Wang Zhan continued, but I've already lost. Since you helped me, then I'm a sore loser. Yi Xian blinked. I didn't help you. Wang Zhan frowned slightly. Brother Yi, you. Yi Xian smiled. There's enmity between me and the tiny abode. Now, I intend to resolve that enmity. So, it can't be considered as me helping you. Wang Zhan had a slightly complicated expression on his face. Brother Yi, you. Right at this moment, Zhu Xiao said abruptly, aren't you going to thank Yi Xian? Wang Zhan hesitated for a moment before he said, thank you. Yi Xian smiled. We're friends, so there's no need to be so polite. Friends. Wang Zhan glanced at Yi Xian. Brother Yi, I'll definitely repay your kindness today. Yi Xian smiled, and then he turned around to gaze at the white-haired old man. Didn't all of you want to kill me? I'm right here right now. The white-haired old man stared at Yi Xian. Situ, kill him. Situ. The man with the blade looked at Yi Xian. Then he dashed out immediately. He was swift like a bolt of lightning. However, Situ retreated explosively by over 300 m in the next moment. Everyone here was stunned. What's going on? The white-haired old man's face had turned gloomy. Yi Xian's sword was even swifter than Situ's saber. A trace of a solemn expression appeared in Situ's eyes as well. How swift! Yi Xian said with a smile, again. Situ was about to attack, but his pupils suddenly constricted. He'd just drawn his saber when a sword had stabbed right into the center of his forehead. It was an instant kill. The expressions of everyone here had changed. It was too swift. It wasn't flashy at all, it was just swift. At this moment, Situ wasn't dead yet, but his soul and consciousness had been locked onto by Yi Xian's sword. The flying sword hold. He'd combined the flying sword with the soul hold technique. Suddenly, the white-haired old man roared furiously, "How dare you!" As he spoke, he was about to attack. However, his pupils suddenly constricted, and he was just about to dodge when a sword stabbed right into his head. Hiss! A strand of blood sprayed from the back of his head. Everyone here was stunned. Including the white-haired old man himself. He was a great saint. But he'd actually been instantly killed by a single strike? The eyes of everyone here were filled with fear. Including Zhu Xiao and the others. Yi Xian's sword was truly too swift. Situ's saber was very swift as well, but it was like a child before Yi Xian's sword. Their speeds weren't on the same level at all. Meanwhile, Yi Xian had arrived in front of Situ. Situ gazed at Yi Xian in silence. Suddenly, an anxious voice resounded from afar, "Brother Yi, he's from the god's graveyard. You can't kill him. You absolutely can't." Yi Xian turned around and saw a woman tearing through space towards him. It was exactly Xiao Linlang. The white-haired old man who still hadn't died spoke ferociously, "Yi Xian, he's from the god's graveyard. If you kill him, then even the supreme laws might not be able to protect you." Yi Xian suddenly slashed with his sword. Hiss! Situ's head flew into the air. Directly erased. Yi Xian turned to look at the white-haired elder. "The necropolis of the gods. Can you take one of my swords?" The white-haired elder was dumbfounded. Chapter 1796. The God's Graveyard. What was that place? It was the #1 forbidden area in the entire ancient god galaxy. Even extraordinary powers like the great spiritual god palace and the battle pavilion were extremely fearful of that place. But Yi Xian had actually said that he couldn't take a single attack from him. A single attack? Is he that arrogant? The palace master of the great spiritual god palace, Qinjiang, stared fixedly at Yi Xian. He isn't even afraid of the god's graveyard. Yan Shi spoke solemnly, "I never expected that the minor spiritual god palace would actually invite the help of a genius from the god's graveyard. No wonder Wang Zhan wasn't a match for him." What surprised me even more was that Situ was actually killed by a single attack from Yi Xian. As he spoke, he looked at Yi Xian, who was not far away, with fear in his eyes. How strong is this guy? Qinjiang fell silent as well. How strong is Yi Xian? Suddenly, the white-haired old man spoke ferociously, "Yi Xian, how dare you kill a genius from the god's graveyard? You!" Yi Xian suddenly opened his palm, and the green profound sword directly sank into the white-haired old man's forehead, instantly absorbing his soul completely. However, that wasn't the end of it. Yi Xian turned around to look at the experts from the minor spiritual god palace. With a command in his heart, besides the 2 remaining great saints, the heads of all the experts from the minor spiritual god palace flew into the air. Instant kill. At this moment, the expressions of everyone here changed drastically. Killing a saint was like killing a chicken. It was too terrifying. Even the eyes of Chen Jiang and the other senior great saints were filled with fear. Even they were extremely afraid of the speed of Yi Xian's flying sword. Yi Xian gazed at the two remaining great saints from the minor spiritual god palace. He was just about to attack when the two great saints vanished. They've fled. Yi Xian was stunned. They fled just like that? Yi Xian fell silent as he watched the two great saints vanish into the sky. It wasn't that he didn't want to give chase, but he couldn't catch up at all unless he used the green profound sword. His flying sword could only reach that terrifying speed within a certain range. If it exceeded that range, his flying sword would not be able to reach that terrifying speed. What a pity. Yi Xian shook his head and sheathed his green profound sword. The souls of the two great sages were a great supplement for the Qingxian sword. His green profound sword was a growth-type sword. If it could devour the souls of those great sages, it would have a great chance of reaching the next level. If the Qingxian sword broke through again, Yi Xian didn't even dare to think about it. This sword itself was very abnormal. Right at this moment, Xiao Linlang, who was beside Yi Xian, suddenly said in a low voice, "Brother Yi, you're being impulsive." Yi Xian looked at Xiao Linlang and asked, "Kill the small caves?" Xiao Linlang shook her head, "It's the Godslayer's cemetery." Yi Xian smiled. "Can you tell me more about the graveyard of the gods?" After a moment of silence, Xiao Linlang said, "It's an extremely terrifying place. It's even more terrifying than the ruins of Sword Sect. We still dared to go to the ruins of Sword Sect, but we don't even dare to go to the graveyard of the gods." Yi Xian asked softly, "Is it that mysterious?" Xiao Linlang nodded. "It's mysterious and powerful." With that, she looked at Yi Xian with a complicated look in her eyes. "I was really being impulsive." Yi Xian said with a smile, "I want to kill you. It was difficult for me to retract my sword." Xiao Linlang said softly, "Brother Yi is much stronger than I imagined." Yi Xian laughed and said, "Miss Linlang, how much do you know about the graveyard of the gods?" Xiao Linlang shook her head. "I don't know much, but there's a place that I should know a lot about." Yi Xian asked, "What place?" Xiao Linlang said in a low voice, "Xiao Lu." Yi Xian frowned slightly. "Xiao Lu?" Xiao Linlang nodded. "It's also a somewhat mysterious place." With that, she pointed with her finger, and a white light entered the space between Yi Xian's eyebrows. Xiao Linlang withdrew her finger and said, "This is the address to Xiao Lu. However, young Master Yi should be mentally prepared. That place is very dark. If you want to obtain information, you'll have to pay a huge price." Yi Xian smiled. "Understood." Xiao Linlang said, "Brother Yi, I still have things to do, so I'll be taking my leave." With that, she turned around and disappeared into the horizon. At this moment, Zhu Shao walked over with Wang Zhan. Zhu Shao cupped his fists at Yi Xian. "Young Master Yi, thank you for today." These words of thanks were sincere and sincere. If it weren't for Yi Xian, Wang Zhan would have died. And that would be an unbearable loss for the battle pavilion. Nurturing a Wang Zhan was not an easy task. Yi Xian smiled. "There's no need to thank me. Brother Wang and I are friends." Wang Zhan glanced at Yi Xian with a complicated expression. Yi Xian said, "Brother Wang, today's setback isn't a bad thing. What do you think?" Wang Zhan nodded. "There's always someone better out there." Yi Xian laughed. "It won't be long before Brother Wang Zhan's strength reaches new heights." A smile appeared on Zhu Zhao's face as well. Today's defeat wasn't a bad thing for Wang Zhan. Wang Zhan no longer had any arrogance in his heart. To Wang Zhan, today's setback was equivalent to a rebirth. Zhu Shao suddenly said, "Little friend Yi, we'll be taking our leave." Yi Xian nodded. "Take care." Wang Zhan cupped his fists. "Brother Yi, take care." With that, he, Zhu Shao, and the rest of the battle pavilion experts disappeared. At this time, Li Shiran also said, "Brother Yi, I'm going back too." Yi Xian looked at Li Shiran. With a tap of his finger, a spatial ring landed in front of Li Shiran. Li Shiran's expression changed drastically when he glanced at it. There were a total of 100,000 fortune divine crystals in the spatial ring. Li Shiran looked at Yi Xian in astonishment. "Brother Yi, this is?" Yi Xian smiled. "The outer disciple's salary is small, keep it." Li Shiran shook his head. "No. I can't take it." Yi Xian said with a smile, "Take it. This is not charity. I treat you as a friend. Do you understand what I mean?" Li Shiran was silent. Yi Xian smiled. "Don't be so wishy-washy. Take it quickly." "Oh right." He took out another spatial ring and handed it to Li Shiran. "This is my gift to Elder Gu Qing. Give it to him for me." After a moment of silence, Li Shiran said, "Brother Yi, how good would it be if you were still in the outer disciples?" Yi Xian laughed. Li Shiran did not say anything else. He kept the two spatial rings. "Brother Yi, we'll meet again." After saying that, he disappeared into the horizon. Around them, the experts that came from other places also left. Yi Xian's name spread like a plague across the heavens. Instant kill of a great sage. The current Yi Xian could be said to be the #1 prodigy in the heavens. Small Grotto Heaven. Beside the lake, in front of the small Grotto Heaven Lord, a shadow was whispering something. After a long time, the old man said softly, "Instant kill of a great sage?" The shadow nodded. "The speed of this person's flying sword is unprecedented. It's terrifying." The old man narrowed his eyes. A cold light flashed in his eyes. When did he become so terrifying? The shadow shook his head. He wasn't this terrifying before. After he came out of the mausoleum of swords, his strength became so terrifying. The old man said in a low voice, "He had a fortuitous encounter there." The shadow nodded. "I think so." The old man fell silent for a long time. "We can't let him live." The shadow nodded. "He has already matured. If we allow him to continue growing, the consequences will be unimaginable." The old man suddenly said, "What did the god's graveyard say?" The shadow shook his head. "They haven't responded yet." The old man said, "Yi Xian killed Situ. They won't let it go. Of course, we are responsible for this as well." He paused for a moment before he said, "Ask second brother Li to go there. Ask him to bring a few more people." The shadow hesitated for a moment before he said, "This person already has the strength to instantly kill a great sage." The old man glanced at the shadow. "I don't believe that he can even kill second brother Li. Just ask them to be careful." The shadow nodded. "All right." After saying that, he turned and left. After the shadow left, the old man fell silent for a long time. After a long time, he suddenly stood up and walked towards the distance. It didn't take long for the old man to arrive at the peak of a mountain. There was a luxurious palace there, and there was only a single statue in the palace. A statue of a woman. This woman was the supreme law of the world. And this statue had been built by the ancestors of the small abode. The old man walked to the statue in the palace and bowed slightly to it with an extremely respectful expression. He would come here every once in a while to pay his respects. The supreme law of the universe. This was the faith of the small abode. After a long time, the old man bowed again. "Supreme, please bless my small abode for 10,000 years." After Yi Xian left the ancient star region with Dao Yi and Shaoan, he arrived at a lake according to the address Xiao Linlang had given him. There was a small pavilion by the lake. The pavilion was built by the lake. It wasn't large, but it was very exquisite. A small pavilion. When Yi Xian and the others arrived not far from the pavilion, a woman in a green dress came to greet them. The woman in the green dress bowed slightly to Yi Xian. You must be young Master Yi? Yi Xian looked at the woman and smiled. You knew I was coming. The woman nodded. Master said young Master Yi would come. Yi Xian smiled. Your master is very resourceful. Does your master know why I'm here? The woman smiled. Master said young Master Yi is here to inquire about God's graveyard. Yi Xian nodded. Yes. The woman shook her head. Yi Xian smiled. What do you mean by shaking your head? The woman looked at Yi Xian. Young Master Yi, master means that young Master Yi is too late. Yi Xian was puzzled. What do you mean? The woman said, in the entire ancient God star sector and outside of it, there is no force that can compare to God's graveyard. In other words, young Master Yi, you will die for sure. Yi Xian blinked. This is what your master said? The woman nodded. Yes. Yi Xian smiled. I understand. Having said that, he looked at Dao Yi. Let's go. Dao Yi nodded slightly. He took Shaoan and left with Yi Xian. After a few steps, the woman behind Yi Xian suddenly said, Young Master Yi. Yi Xian stopped and turned to look at the woman. The woman said, Young Master Yi, you know nothing about God's graveyard. When you come into contact with them, all your confidence will vanish, and only fear will remain. Now, death is getting closer and closer to you. Can you feel it? Yi Xian was speechless. P.S. You know nothing about the use of monthly tickets. Do you know what monthly tickets are for? Monthly tickets can be exchanged for bonuses. But in your hands, you can't exchange them. But I can. So, do you understand? Chapter 1797. Needless to say, Yi Xian was speechless at this moment. This woman is saying that I will definitely die. Without a word, Yi Xian left with Dao Yi and Shaoan. At this time, the woman said, Young Master Yi, you, Yi Xian suddenly raised his middle finger. Get lost. With that, he disappeared into the distance with Dao Yi and Shaoan. Behind him, the woman watched Yi Xian and the other two leave with a calm expression. On the other side, Dao Yi said, This God's graveyard is not simple. Yi Xian smiled. Let's not bother about them. Dao Yi nodded. What's your plan now? Yi Xian looked at the sky. If I'm not wrong, the people from the small cave heaven are coming for me. Dao Yi looked at Yi Xian. This time, the people from the small cave heaven are coming for me. Yi Xian said, I know. Dao Yi asked, Can you handle it yourself? Yi Xian laughed. With the sword in my hand, I am invincible. Dao Yi patted Yi Xian's head. Have you forgotten how miserable you were in the past? Yi Xian was speechless. Dao Yi said, I know you are strong and you will not underestimate your enemy. But you still have to be careful, understand? Yi Xian nodded. I know. He would not underestimate his enemy. He had not reached the level of Qing, and his father, who could look down on everyone in the world. As if he thought of something, Yi Xian said, Are you going back to the great spiritual palace? Dao Yi nodded. There are many things I want to learn from them. As she said that, she glanced at Yi Xian, smiled and said, Let her follow me. Dao Yi nodded. She's not simple. I can't let her follow me. It's best if she follows you. Yi Xian nodded. He took out a storage ring and handed it to Dao Yi. For you. Dao Yi glanced at Yi Xian and accepted the gift. Yi Xian was a little speechless. Aren't you going to see what it is? Dao Yi replied, There's no need for that. Yi Xian shook his head and smiled. Then take care. If anyone bullies you in the great spiritual God palace, contact me. Dao Yi looked at Yi Xian. And then? Yi Xian blinked his eyes. I will destroy the great spiritual god palace. Dao Yi shook his head and laughed. You're very arrogant now. With that, she turned around and left. Yi Xian suddenly said, Don't let yourself be bullied. Dao Yi waved her hand lightly. I know. After saying that, she disappeared. Shaoan turned to look at Yi Xian. Brother Yi Xian, where are we going now? Yi Xian smiled. I have something to do. With that, he took out the Qingxian sword and was about to leave with Shaoan. At that moment, a terrifying aura suddenly swept down from the sky. It's here. Yi Xian turned to look at Shaoan and said with a smile, Let's go and play with Xiao Ta first. With that, he put Shaoan into Xiao Ta's body. At that moment, an old man appeared not far away from Yi Xian. The old man had his hands behind his back. He stood straight and his eyes were extremely sharp. Great sage. The old man was Old Li from the small grotto heaven. Behind Li Lao Air, there were 3 people. All of them were great sages. Old Li looked at Yi Xian. I heard that you can kill great sages in seconds. You. Just as he said this, his pupils suddenly shrank, and his right arm suddenly blocked in front of him. Bang! An expanse of sword light shattered as second brother Li retreated explosively by over 1 kilometer. As soon as he stopped moving, the layer of golden armor on his right arm shattered into pieces. Seeing that. If this chapter is not over, please continue to the next page. Old Li's expression became extremely serious. However, at that moment, another sword radiance slashed at him. It was so fast that it could not be seen by the naked eye. Old Li's expression changed drastically. He quickly raised his left arm to block. Bang! Another wave of sword light erupted, and Old Li's second brother was forced to retreat repeatedly. In the distance, Yi Xian slowly walked towards Li Lao Air. He did not make a move, but Li Lao Air retreated rapidly. Because one after another, the flying swords slashed at Old Li. The speed of the flying swords was too fast. They were so fast that Old Li could not dodge them and could only block them. At that moment, he could only block them with his physical body. No, he could only block them with the relic armor he was wearing. Just like that, Yi Xian walked toward Old Li slowly. With every step he took, Old Li retreated hundreds of feet away. At the side, the other 2 great sages were dumbfounded. Just as they were about to attack, 2 flying swords slashed at them and sent them flying. They did not even have the strength to fight back. Fast. Yi Xian's flying swords were not particularly powerful, but they were fast. After Yi Xian had taken 10 steps, the divine armor on Li Lao Air's body directly exploded, and almost in an instant, a sword directly stabbed into his chest. Defeated. He did not even have the time to attack. Old Li raised his head and looked at Yi Xian in the distance. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Yi Xian walked to Old Li's front and took out the green mysterious sword. He raised his hand and slashed. The green mysterious sword sank into Old Li's forehead. In an instant, Old Li's soul was absorbed. After absorbing Old Li's soul, the green mysterious sword trembled violently. Xiao Han said excitedly, Young master, this sword is very nourishing. Yi Xian smiled. Xiao Han, how long will it take for you to break through? Xiao Han thought for a moment and said, I need to devour at least 100 experts of this level before I can break through. 100 great sages. Yi Xian was speechless. Were there 100 great sages in a few super forces? They could not possibly slaughter the entire ancient god star field. As if thinking of something, Yi Xian suddenly said, Xiao Han, can you devour those artifact spirits? Xiao Han said, I think so. Yi Xian said, devour Xiao Ta. I think if you devour him, you will definitely break through immediately. Xiao Han. Xiao Ta suddenly jumped up. Damn, young master, you are not human. Yi Xian laughed. Of course, he was joking. However, if Xiao Hun really devoured Xiao Ta, he might really break through. Of course, he would not dare. His father would definitely skin him alive. There was still a little gap between him and Dad. He could not fight Dad head-on. At this time, Xiao Hun suddenly said, "Young master, can you use me next time to kill someone?" Yi Xian smiled. "Why, you want to kill someone?" Xiao Hun said excitedly, "Yes." Yi Xian laughed. "I want to hide and nurture the sword." The sword was the green mysterious sword, and the sword was also the green mysterious sword. The green mysterious sword and the power of the bloodline were his last trump cards. No, there was also the sword will of Dad. Yi Xian withdrew his thoughts and looked at the other two great sages of the minor heavens in the distance who were locked by his sword light. With a thought, the green mysterious sword directly absorbed the two people. Yi Xian opened his palm, and the green mysterious sword appeared in his hand. The next moment, his whole body disappeared. Chi! In an instant, the spacetime in front of Yi Xian split, and the next moment, Yi Xian appeared in a palace hall. Qingcheng. Inside the hall, a woman in a dragon robe was reading memorials. "This chapter is not over, please continue." As if sensing something, the woman suddenly looked up. When she saw Yi Xian, the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. This smile made all flowers pale in comparison. The woman was Tuoba Yen. Yi Xian walked up to Tuoba Yen, grabbed his hand, and said with a smile, "Did you miss me?" Tuoba Yen said softly, "Didn't you say you would come back once a month? How many months has it been?" Yi Xian gently hugged Tuoba Yen. "It's my fault." Tuoba Yen suddenly said, "Give me a child." Hearing this, Yi Xian was stunned. Tuoba Yen looked up at Yi Xian, blushing. "Can you do it?" Yi Xian blinked. "Don't you know if I can do it or not?" Tuoba Yen pinched Yi Xian's waist hard and said shyly, "You're asking for a beating." Yi Xian laughed. He carried Tuoba Yen and walked toward the inner hall. In the room, Yi Xian wrapped his arms around Tuoba Yen's slender waist and his hands slowly moved downwards. It's not suitable to write in detail here, so I've automatically omitted 10,000 words. Everyone, fill in the blanks. 5 days later. Early in the morning, Yi Xian lay in front of the stone steps of the hall. A warm sun slowly rose in the sky. The sunlight shone on his body, warm and very comfortable. At this moment, Tuoba Yen walked to Yi Xian's side. At this moment, she was no longer wearing the dragon robe, but white pajamas, and her graceful figure was unmistakable. Tuoba Yen sat beside Yi Xian and said softly, "I really want you to stay here." Yi Xian smiled. "I want that too." All these years, I'm a little tired of the days of fighting and killing outside. But the current me is not qualified to live an ordinary life. An ordinary life? In times of peace, that was not a difficult thing. But in a universe like this, it was too difficult. Did Qing and I do anything wrong back then? We did nothing wrong. But Tendo destroyed the world, and countless people died tragically. In troubled times, being weak was wrong. Tuoba Yen said softly, "I know. But I can't bear to part with you." Yi Xian suddenly smiled. "Yen, what do you like about me?" Tuoba Yen blinked, then smiled. "I like your shamelessness." Yi Xian was struck dumb. Then he burst out laughing. Tuoba Yen said softly, "Will I have children?" Yi Xian said with a smile, "If you're worried, then I'll have to work hard and stay for a few more days." With that, he disappeared on the spot with Tuoba Yen. 5 days later, Yi Xian left behind a spatial ring and went to Azure Water Academy. He gave Mo Yunqi the soul wood that the swordsman woman, Yi, had given him in the Mausoleum of Swords. Yi only wanted this child to live an ordinary life, and the academy was more suitable for him. At the very least, he must have the ability to rely on himself. Yi Xian also stored the cultivation methods, martial techniques, and swordsmanship insights that Yi had given him in a storage ring, and he gave this storage ring to Mo Yinchi. The child's future depended on his own choices. After handing over everything, Yi Xian left Azure Province. In front of the palace hall, Tuoba Yen looked at the horizon, her eyes filled with reluctance. At this moment, a voice suddenly sounded in the distance. "Your Majesty, everyone is waiting for you to attend court." The reluctance in Tuoba Yan's eyes disappeared. She turned and left. At this moment, she became the aloof empress again. Her gentleness was only for Yi Xian. After leaving Azure Province, Yi Xian went straight to the small grotto heaven. He did not like to be passive. He wanted to take the initiative. "Didn't your small grotto heaven want to mess with me? Don't look for me. I'll do it myself." End of this chapter. Chapter 1798. Building. A woman in a green dress walked slowly to the front of the building and bowed slightly. "Master, we have received news that Yi Xian is going to the small grotto heaven." Small grotto heaven. At this moment, the door suddenly opened and a man walked out slowly. The man wore a simple black robe and held a feather fan in his hand. The man smiled. "This young Master Yi is going to the small grotto heaven of his own accord." The woman nodded. "I think so." The man smiled. "There's going to be a good show." The woman stood behind the man respectfully and did not speak. The man looked up at the sky and said softly, "Yi Xian is not afraid of the small grotto heaven or the god's graveyard." The person behind him is definitely not ordinary. As he spoke, a trace of doubt flashed in his eyes. "But I have observed the universe and there is no force that can compare to the god's graveyard," the woman suddenly said. "According to our investigation, Yi Xian disappeared for a period of time, but we can't find out where he went." The man turned to look at the woman. "Even our people can't find him?" The woman nodded. "He disappeared very strangely. We can't find him even after entering the space-time tunnel. Not only did he disappear strangely, but he also appeared strangely." The man frowned slightly. "This person is so mysterious." The woman suddenly said again, "I have received news that someone came out of the god's graveyard." Hearing this, the man narrowed his eyes. "Do you know who it is?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know yet. But our people are already looking for him. We should be able to find him." The man smiled. "Prepare a big gift. If you know his whereabouts, inform me immediately." The woman said in a low voice, "Master, you don't think Yi Xian can do it?" The man shook his head. "It's not that I don't think he can do it, but I think the god's graveyard is better." As he spoke, he gently waved his feather fan and a trace of seriousness flashed in his eyes. "This is the god's graveyard. Even the supreme laws of the universe have to show some respect." At this point, he turned to look at the woman and said with a smile, "Can Yi Xian make the supreme law of the universe give him face? Can he?" Ha! In just a short while, the building's master disappeared with the woman. War Pavilion. Inside the main hall, all the experts had gathered. The master of the War Pavilion, Zhu Shao, said in a deep voice, "Yi Xian went to the small grotto heaven. What do you think of this?" Everyone fell silent. Zhu Shao looked at Elderly. "What do you think?" Elderly pondered for a moment and said, "The person behind this person is definitely not weaker than the small cave heaven. But we don't know who the person behind him is. This boy is seriously too mysterious." Zhu Shao turned to look at an old man. "Still haven't found out his background?" The old man said in a deep voice, "We only found one thing. He seems to be related to the swordsman who came to the ancient God Star region before. Those people are from the All-Heaven City, which is very far away from us. They seem to belong to a force called Sword Alliance." Sword Alliance. Zhu Shao frowned. "What kind of force is that?" The old man shook his head. I don't know the details, but they don't seem very strong. Those swordsmen are not weak, but most of them are only at the Great Qin realm. Zhu Xiao said after a moment of silence, continue to investigate this sword alliance. The old man nodded. Understood. At this moment, Elderly suddenly said, Yi Xian helped the war pavilion before, but now he is looking for the small grotto heaven. What do you think of this? Zhu Xiao said after a moment of silence, if it's just a small grotto heaven, the war pavilion will definitely help. This chapter is not over, please continue to the next page. We will help, but there is still God's graveyard. God's graveyard. Everyone in the main hall was silent. The war pavilion was also afraid of that place. That was the #1 forbidden area. At this moment, Elderly suddenly said, then we can only wait and see. Zhu Xiao nodded. That's the only way. Elderly said again, God's graveyard has sent someone. Should we show our support? Zhu Xiao said after a moment of silence, prepare a big gift. I will deliver it personally. Great Spiritual God Palace. Qin Jiang, the palace master of Great Spiritual God Palace, immediately summoned Yan Shi when he learned that Yi Xian was going to the small grotto heaven. Qin Jiang said in a deep voice, what is he trying to do? Yan Shi said, based on his personality, I'm afraid he is going to fight to the death with the small grotto heaven. Qin Jiang frowned slightly. Why? Yan Shi said softly, that's the most terrifying thing because we don't know what he is relying on. Qin Jiang said indifferently, the sword in his hand contains the power of the supreme law, and the support of the small grotto heaven is also the supreme law of the universe. Then, he sneered. He is seeking his own death. Yan Shi glanced at Qin Jiang. Palace Master, do you want him to die? Qin Jiang said after a moment of silence, of course. Yan Shi sighed in his heart. Yi Xian's relationship with Great Spiritual God Palace was not very pleasant. Previously, Yi Xian had killed several people from Great Spiritual God Palace, which was quite embarrassing for Great Spiritual God Palace. At this moment, Qin Jiang suddenly said, let's see how he is going to fight to the death with the small grotto heaven. Also, as far as I know, the god's graveyard has also sent someone out. Then, he paused and said, prepare a big gift. I want to meet him personally. Don't neglect it. After that, he disappeared on the spot. Sky Demon Kingdom. In a certain luxurious hall, an old man squatted in front of a brazier. Opposite him sat a woman with a whip. The woman wore an animal skin dress. Although it was not as beautiful as a human's dress, it exuded a sense of wildness and had a different kind of elegance. Both of them were roasting meat. The woman turned the wooden stick on the meat. Grandpa, I heard that there is a super monster called Yi Xian recently. This person defeated a genius from the god's graveyard. The old man smiled. Xiao wants to fight him? The woman nodded. Yes. The old man thought for a moment and said, he is a swordsman. The woman's lips curled up slightly. Can his sword break through my body? The old man fell silent. The woman glanced at the old man. Grandpa, you know him? The old man nodded. I know Dao Yi well. This person is not that simple. The woman was even more interested. She tore off a piece of meat and put it in her mouth. Then I want to fight him even more. The old man thought for a moment and said, you can go look for him. But don't become enemies with him. Understand? The woman nodded. Yes. After that, she carried the piece of meat and left. The old man suddenly said, aren't you going to leave some for Grandpa? The woman disappeared into the distance without looking back. The old man shook his head and smiled. Foodie. At this moment, a middle-aged man appeared not far away from the old man. The middle-aged man said in a deep voice, Father, what do you think about Yi Xian going to the small grotto heaven? The old man replied indifferently, not really. This chapter is not finished. Please continue to the next page. The middle-aged man hesitated for a moment before he said, "According to what I know, Yi Xian has sent someone out from the god's graveyard. Their target seems to be Yi Xian." The old man remained silent. The middle-aged man said, "According to what I know, the great spiritual palace, the battle pavilion, and Xiao Lu have gone to look for that person from the god's graveyard. They want to build a good relationship with him." The old man suddenly said, "What do you think of Yi Xian?" The middle-aged man fell silent for a moment before he said, "A genius." As he spoke, he seemed to have thought of something, and his expression changed slightly. "Father, don't tell me you intend to stand on his side?" The old man said indifferently, "Are you afraid?" The middle-aged man hurriedly nodded. "Father, this is not a joke. If we choose to stand on Yi Xian's side, then it's equivalent to becoming enemies with the small grotto heaven and the god's graveyard. I'm afraid we can't bear the consequences." The old man remained expressionless. "So, you want to stand on the small grotto heaven and the god's graveyard?" The middle-aged man spoke in a low voice. "The small grotto heaven is fine, but I think that we have to make friends with the god's graveyard." The old man gazed at the middle-aged man. "What do you think of Yi Xian?" he asked again. The middle-aged man hesitated for a moment before he said, "He's a monstrous genius." The old man stared at the middle-aged man. "What else?" The middle-aged man laughed bitterly. "Father, just speak your mind." The old man sighed softly. "Do you know why I haven't passed on the throne to you?" The middle-aged man spoke in a low voice. "Father isn't satisfied with me." The old man said, "I'm very dissatisfied with you. It wasn't easy for our Sky Demon Kingdom to develop to its current scale. Our Sky Demon Kingdom is very strong, but that's exactly why we have to be even more careful. Let me ask you, why did Yi Xian dare to go to the small grotto heaven?" The middle-aged man said, "He had something to rely on." The old man continued, "Why did he dare to kill someone from the god's graveyard? Was it because he was ignorant?" The middle-aged Ji's expression gradually turned solemn. "He isn't afraid of the god's graveyard." The old man nodded. "That's the main point. Yi Xian, isn't afraid of the god's graveyard at all. Also." As he spoke, he slowly clenched his right hand. "This person can instantly kill a great saint. Think about it, can an ordinary person or an ordinary force nurture such a genius?" The middle-aged man fell silent. The old man continued, "The god's graveyard is very strong, but can this Yi Xian be any weaker?" The middle-aged man said in a low voice, "Make friends with Yi Xian?" The old man shook his head. The middle-aged man was stunned. The old man suddenly spoke again, "Make friends with both sides. You go see the people from the god's graveyard, I'll go see this Yi Xian." The middle-aged man, the old man stood up and left. When he reached the door, he said, "We'll only be friends, not enemies. They can fight their battles, we'll fight ours." With that, he disappeared. Inside the hall, the middle-aged man smiled bitterly. In an unknown mountain range, a sword light suddenly descended. The sword light dissipated, and Yi Xian appeared at the top of a mountain. At this moment, an angry shout suddenly sounded from afar. "Who dares to trespass into my small grotto heaven?" As the voice fell, the space in front of Yi Xian suddenly split open, and an old man walked out. The old man looked at Yi Xian. "Who are you? What are you doing in my small grotto heaven?" The corners of Yi Xian's mouth curled up slightly. "Yi Xian." As he spoke, he paused, then said, "I'm here. Tu Zong. Tu Zong. P.S. Asking for votes." End of this chapter. Chapter 1799. Tu Zong. As soon as these words were spoken, the old man was instantly infuriated, and he was just about to speak when a ray of light flashed through his throat. Hiss. Before the old man could react, his head flew into the air along with a wisp of blood. Instant kill. After killing the old man, Yi Xian walked towards the grotto heaven. During this time, numerous powerful auras shot towards Yi Xian. Yi Xian kept walking into the distance with a calm look on his face. And with every step he took, a bloody head would fly into the sky in the distance. A flying sword with every step he took, and a head with every flying sword. In less than 10 breaths of time, more than 10 heads fell from the sky. Some of them were minor saints. They were all instant kills. No one could stop Yi Xian's flying sword. The experts that had rushed over in secret were extremely shocked and they witnessed this scene. It was too terrifying. Even a great saint couldn't stop Yi Xian's flying sword. The great spiritual palace master stared at Yi Xian. Why is his flying sword so fast? Yan Shi shook his head. I don't know. Looking at Yi Xian, the fear in the depths of the great spiritual divine palace's eyes became more and more intense. So did their killing intent. The speed of Yi Xian's flying sword was too terrifying. In the distance, Yi Xian had arrived at the other side of a mountain. During this time, no one came out to stop him. When Yi Xian stopped, a middle-aged man suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian. Kujia! Someone exclaimed in the dark. Kujia! He was the guardian of the grotto heaven. No one had expected that the grotto heaven would send out a guardian. However, it was normal. Ordinary people weren't a match for Yi Xian. Even a great saint couldn't stop Yi Xian's flying sword. Kujia looked at Yi Xian. You came to Tu Zone? Yi Xian smiled. Do you have a problem with that? Kujia looked Yi Xian in the eye. Let me see you. Just as he finished speaking, a flying sword suddenly slashed towards him. Kujia raised his right arm. Boom! A streak of sword light shattered as Kujia retreated 1,000 feet. However, he forcibly blocked Yi Xian's flying sword. Yi Xian glanced at Kujia's right arm. Under his right sleeve, there was a dark arm guard. Another divine item. Yi Xian shook his head. I look down on people who use external objects the most. How boring. Xiao Ta, in the distance, Kujia glanced at his bracer, and there was a deep gash on it. A trace of seriousness appeared in his eyes. If it wasn't for this bracer, he might have been instantly killed just now. Right at this moment, Yi Xian suddenly took another step forward. Kujia immediately raised his arm to block. Boom! When the sword light appeared, Kujia retreated another 1,000 feet. As soon as he stopped, another flying sword slashed at him. Boom! Kujia retreated another 1,000 feet. Just like that, every time Yi Xian took a step forward, Kujia would retreat 100 feet. The countless gazes in the surroundings had become extremely solemn when they witnessed this scene. This was too terrifying. Kujia was not an ordinary great sage. He was a veteran great sage who had become a great sage tens of thousands of years ago. This was a true great sage. However, even such a super expert was not a match for Yi Xian. He was hung up and beaten by Yi Xian. Finally, when Yi Xian took the 10th step, the bracer on Kujia's right arm exploded, and at practically the same time, a flying sword slashed straight towards him. Kujia's pupils shrank, and he stamped his right foot down. Condense. As his voice fell, the space around him suddenly condensed into a spatial barrier. Not only that, there was also a temporal dimensional barrier. At this moment, the area where Kujia was located was practically impregnable. However, under everyone's gaze, Yi Xian's sword landed on his right arm. Hiss! Kujia's right arm flew into the air. It was like the spatial barrier and temporal barrier didn't exist at all. The eyes of countless experts in the surroundings were filled with disbelief when they witnessed this scene. Why is Yi Xian's flying sword able to disregard both space and time? Kujia's eyes were filled with disbelief as well. Right at this moment, a flying sword suddenly slashed towards him. It was extremely swift, and he didn't even have the time to react before it was already standing on his head. Bang! Kujia was pushed over 1 kilometer back. However, he didn't die. Because a ray of dark golden light had obstructed Yi Xian's flying sword. Yi Xian frowned when he witnessed this scene. You're using external forces again. Don't you think it's shameful to use external forces? Kujia stared fixedly at Yi Xian, and the fear in his eyes had transformed into a trace of terror. Yi Xian's flying sword is too terrifying. Right at this moment, Yi Xian suddenly took a step forward. This step caused Kujia's expression to instantly change drastically, and he was just about to strike with his fist. However, he was still too late. A flying sword had slashed down directly against his head. Bang! Light erupted from the sword, and then Kujia was pushed over 1 kilometer back. However, he just retreated when numerous flying swords slashed down towards him. Bang! 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 Kujia retreated explosively. When he'd retreated for an entire 30 kilometers, the dark barrier of light around him had suddenly shattered, and a sword had pierced through the space between his brows at practically the exact same moment. Hiss! Kujia's figure instantly became illusory. Everyone here was stunned. He's dead. A great saint has perished just like that. Kujia, who hadn't died yet, stared fixedly at Yi Xian. Who exactly are you? At this moment, he finally realized that they'd been underestimating Yi Xian all along. They'd greatly underestimated him. Earlier, they'd even sent some mortal-severing realm experts to kill Yi Xian. Now that he thought about it, it was truly too laughable. Yi Xian walked over to Kujia and gazed at him. I'm Yi Xian. As soon as he finished speaking, he withdrew the green profound sword and stabbed it into Kujia's body. Bang! At the instant that the green profound sword entered Kujia's body, Kujia's expression instantly changed drastically, and his eyes were filled with terror. He swiftly turned around to look towards the direction of the heaven abode. He wanted to say something, but he didn't have the chance. The green profound sword had directly absorbed his soul. It was completely gone. Yi Xian put the green profound sword away and continued forward. Right at this moment, an old man suddenly appeared in front of Yi Xian. Bang! In an instant, the space around Yi Xian had started to burn. Yi Xian suddenly drew his sword and slashed. As the sword slashed down, a wave of sword radiance instantly shattered the flames, and he himself was forced to retreat several hundred feet away. After stopping, Yi Xian looked at the old man. At this moment, Xiao Linlang's voice suddenly rang out in his mind. This person is the cave master of the heaven abode, Mu Su. He reached the great sage level hundreds of thousands of years ago, and now he's even more unfathomable. The cave master had come out. Yi Xian looked at Mu Su and smiled. So you're the one who's been chasing after me and trying to kill me? Mu Su looked at Yi Xian coldly. I admit that I've underestimated you. Yi Xian laughed out loud. I have no grudges with your small grotto heaven, but your small grotto heaven kept chasing after me. As he spoke, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. You don't have to chase after me everywhere, I'll do it myself. Right now, I, Yi Xian, am standing in front of your heaven abode. I, Yi Xian, beg for your life. Beg for his life. His voice was like thunder, shaking the heavens. Someone was begging for his life in front of the heaven abode. Muksuhi stared at Yi Xian. As you wish. As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly vanished on the spot. In the distance, Yi Xian shifted his consciousness, and a flying sword slashed towards Mu Su. Mu Su, on the other hand, did not dodge and allowed the flying sword to strike his chest. Bang! Space instantly shattered into pieces, but Mu Su was completely unharmed. At the same time, he'd appeared in front of Yi Xian, and then he smashed his fist towards Yi Xian. With this punch, the space around Yi Xian instantly ignited. Yi Xian did not retreat. He rushed forward, drew his sword, and slashed. Draw the sword to decide life and death. As soon as the sword was drawn, a wave of sword light swept out from Yi Xian's scabbard like a tide. Rumble. A world-shaking explosion resounded as both Yi Xian and Mu Su retreated explosively at the same time. As they retreated, countless flying swords struck Mu Su, but Mu Shui was completely unharmed. After he stopped moving, Yi Xian gazed at Mu Su, and he noticed that there was a palm-sized black mirror on Mu Su's chest. His flying sword had been stopped by this black mirror. Meanwhile, Xiao Linlan's voice resounded once more in his mind. This is the heavenly abode mirror, and there's an abode within it. It's the number one precious treasure of the minor abode. It's a superb ancient god-ranked treasure. A divine treasure. Yi Xian instantly flared up with rage when he heard this, and he gazed at Mu Su. How shameless. It's fine if you're bullying the weak, but you're actually using an external treasure. How shameless of you to even use an external object. As he spoke, he glanced at the surroundings. Does everyone think he's shameless? The others were speechless. Mu Su's expression was extremely unsightly. He wanted to be shameless as well. However, the flying sword's speed was so terrifying that even he wasn't confident that he could block it. That wasn't the most terrifying thing. The most terrifying thing was that Yi Xian didn't expend much effort to send out these flying swords, and he could send out as many as he wanted, even if he blocked one flying sword. What about the second and third? He had no choice but to use an external treasure. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly looked at Mu Su. Do you dare not use an external treasure? Let's have a fair fight. Mu Su stared fixedly at Yi Xian. Why should I not use an external treasure? Yi Xian said angrily, I'm only at the Heaven Ascension realm. What about you? You're already a great saint. How many realms higher are you than me? But now, we're fighting one-on-one, and you still want to use an external treasure? Doesn't your conscience hurt? Mu Su's expression grew increasingly unsightly, and he couldn't help but curse. Heaven Ascension realm. You're only at the Heaven Ascension realm? Which Heaven Ascension realm cultivator is like you? You can kill a great saint at the drop of a hat. In fact, he was also extremely puzzled. This guy was indeed only at the Heaven Ascension realm. But why was he so terrifying? Not only Mu Su, but everyone present was puzzled. This was killing someone who was several realms above him. At this moment, Yi Xian still wanted to say something, but Mu Su suddenly said, Yi Xian, don't talk nonsense. If I use an external treasure, you can use it too. Yi Xian stared at Mu Su. I usually don't use external treasures. Mu Su looked coldly at Yi Xian. Don't you want to be fair? Isn't it fair if you use an external treasure? Come on, use an external treasure. After a moment of silence, Yi Xian said, I don't think it's good to use external treasures. Let's have a fair fight. Mu Su said angrily, if you use an external treasure, then it's a fair fight, quickly use it. Yi Xian nodded, as you wish. As he spoke, the sword in his hand turned into the green profound sword, and he casually swung it. A sword light directly slashed at Mu Su's chest. Boom! The heavenly abode mirror directly turned into nothingness, and at the same time, Mu Su's physical body also disappeared in an instant, and the green profound sword was already stabbed into his chest. Everyone present was petrified. Mu Su looked at Yi Xian in a daze. Your external treasure is so strong. You're tuning into the Romantic Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.